Welcome back to the quiet apothecary. Settle in wherever you happen to be tonight. Let your shoulders come down from around your ears, and let the day you have had begin, quietly, to loosen its hold on you. There is nothing here that asks anything of you, and nowhere else you need to be. Tonight we do not walk out to the physic garden, nor stand behind the polished counter of the apothecary shop. Tonight we stay indoors, in a low-panelled still room, in an English house, somewhere in the long reign of the Tudors, with a single candle burning steady on the workbench, and a narrow shelf of books above it. Some of those books are freshly printed, the great herbals of the age, their woodcuts of plants pressed onto thick paper. Some are handwritten, the receipt books that passed from a mother's careful hand into a daughter's, each page crowded with cures for every trouble a household might meet. And nearly every cure written in them, to our ears now, sounds a little strange. Honey spread thick over an open wound, a cobweb lifted from the corner of the rafters and laid across a cut, mouldy bread bound to a festering sore, the water of stewed garden snails, kept in a stoppered bottle for the chest and for the skin, willow bark chewed for an aching head. These are the things we will spend our evening with. Not to laugh at them, and not to be alarmed by them, but to take each one down gently from the shelf, turn it over slowly in the candlelight, and unwrap it until we find the small, quiet kernel of real sense that was hidden inside it all along. For this is the curious thing about so many of these old remedies. They sound absurd, and yet a great many of them worked, or worked well enough, and some of them we understand today far better than the Tudors ever could. We will tell all of it as history softly, and never as advice. There is nothing here you need to try, and nothing at all you need to remember. If your eyes close before the second cure, or the 10th, that is entirely as it should be, and you will have missed nothing that will not keep until morning. Picture the room around us as we begin. The fire has settled to a low red glow, the shutters are drawn against the night, and the smell of dried herbs and beeswax and old paper hangs quiet in the still air. On the bench sit the tools of the still room, the mortar and the pestle, the little scales, the stoppered jars and the earthen pots, and the great glass still cold and empty in its corner. This is a good place to spend a long night, unhurried and safe and warm, and there is nothing here that can trouble you. We will simply take the cures down one at a time, and talk them over softly, and let the hours pass. Let us begin where the strangeness is easiest to picture, at an open wound, and the pot of honey a Tudor household kept close for exactly this. Imagine a boy who has cut his arm on a scythe, at the edge of a hayfield, brought in white faced to the kitchen while the light is still good. The woman of the house does not reach first for water, or for wine, or for any bitter herb. She reaches for the honey pot. She spreads a clean linen cloth, lays a good spoonful of honey along it, and binds it over the wound, and she does this with the calm certainty of someone who has done it many times and expects it to answer. To a modern eye, this looks close to reckless, sticky food smeared onto raw and bleeding flesh, exactly the sort of thing you might expect to sour and fester by the following morning. And yet the wound, more often than not, would close clean. Honey as a wound dressing was not a Tudor invention. It was very old already by their time, so old that its true beginnings are lost. The physicians of ancient Egypt wrote it into their papyrus receipts thousands of years before, and the Greek writers whose books the Tudors still read, Dioscorides above all, described honey laid on sores and ulcers as a matter of plain and settled practice. By the 16th century, it had simply always been done. The printed herbals of the age. The Greek herbal that came off the press in 1526, and later John Gerard's great herbal of 1597. Both speak of honey worked into salves and cleansing dressings as one of the most ordinary things in the whole medicine chest, so ordinary that they hardly pause to justify it. We turn now to the reason a Tudor physician believed honey worked, which was quite different from the reason it truly did. The learned medicine of the age still followed the old teaching of the four humours. The notion that the body was governed by blood and phlegm and the two biles, and that health was a matter of their balance. Honey was reckoned in this scheme to be hot and dry in its nature, and a wound that festered was thought to be burdened with cold, wet, corrupt matter that needed drying up and drawing out. So honey, being hot and dry, was the natural thing to lay upon it. The theory was, by our lights, entirely wrong. But it pointed, by good fortune, straight at a remedy that happened to be right. And this odd habit of arriving at true cures for false reasons is something we will meet again and again before the night is out. Let us turn now to the how of it. The small daily craft that surrounded the honey pot. A careful housewife knew that not all honey was equal, though she could not have told you why in the terms we would use. The thickest, darkest honey, the kind that had not been thinned or heated, was held to be the best for a wound, while the pale and runny sort was thought weaker. She would sometimes boil and skim her honey first, lifting off the froth to make what the receipt books called clarified honey, cleaner and keeping better through the year. This she stored in a stoppered pot and drew on for cuts, for burns, for the slow ulcers that opened on the legs of the old and would not heal, and for the raw and chapped skin of hands worked hard through a cold winter. She would often mix it, too, with other things, with a little wheat flour to stiffen it into a paste, with the juice of a wound herb, with rose water for the face, each household keeping its own preferred receipt. There was, in most of these houses, a green salve or a sovereign salve, as the old spelling had it, kept ready-made in a small pot for whatever the week might bring. Its heart was very often honey or beeswax, melted gently together with a little turpentine from the pine, and the strained juice or oil of healing herbs, and this was spread on a cloth and bound over almost any hurt. The surgeons who followed the Tudor armies, men such as Thomas Gale, who served the soldiers of Henry VIII, leaned heavily on such honeyed dressings for the wounds of war, where the alternative was so often a slow and fatal corruption of the flesh. They could not explain why the honey served them, only that a wound kept under it fared better than a wound left dry and open to the air. We turn now to where all that honey came from, for a household that leaned so heavily upon the honey pot most often kept its own bees to fill it. At the bottom of many a Tudor garden stood a row of skeps, the round domed hives woven of coiled straw, and the keeping of them was a quiet art in itself, watched over through the swarming season and robbed, in the late summer, of their heavy combs. Honey was, in that age, the chief sweetness most people ever knew, for the costly sugar loaf was far beyond the reach of ordinary purses, and so the honey harvest was a matter of real importance. sweetening the winter owl, fermenting into the old drink called mead, filling the festival cakes, and stocking the medicine pot besides. A good store of honey was a kind of quiet wealth, a larder and a medicine chest, and a sweet shop all gathered into a few earthen jars, and a careful household guarded it against the long cold months when the bees slept and gave nothing at all. And of all the hurts the honey pot answered, none was answered better than the burn, the commonest wound of a life lived close about an open fire. A child who caught a hand on a hot trivet, a woman scalded by a slopping pot, a man burned at the forge or the hearth, all were treated the same, with honey spread cool and thick over the reddened skin and bound loosely with a soft cloth. It was said that honey took the fire out of a burn, and there was plain truth in the saying, for a burn kept moist and soothed and shielded beneath honey healed, more often than not, with less of the tight and puckered scarring that a burn left dry and open would leave behind. Here again the old habit and the new understanding fall quietly into step, for the moist and covered healing that honey gave a burn is very close to what a careful modern dressing sets out to give one. The Tudor mother reaching for the honey pot, when a child cried out by the fire, was doing, without a book to guide her, and without a reason she could have named, something both gentle and sound. Now here is the quiet sense inside the strangeness, and we can tell it plainly, because a laboratory in our own century has looked closely at exactly this. Honey is not food to a wound. It is, in the language of chemistry, a most unwelcoming place for the small living things that cause a wound to fester. It holds so little free water and pulls water so strongly out of everything around it, that the bacteria which would otherwise multiply in a wound are drawn dry and cannot thrive. It is gently acidic, which they also dislike, and a wound dressed in honey stays moist and covered and undisturbed beneath it, which is very close to the conditions we now know a wound needs in order to knit itself back together. Some honeys do more still. They carry within them a slow chemistry that gives off a faint trace of the same mild cleansing agent a modern nurse might reach for, in amounts so small that they trouble the flesh not at all while troubling the bacteria a great deal. There is a honey gathered from a flowering shrub on the far side of the world, unknown to any Tudor, that our own hospitals now purchase, sterilized and sealed, to dress the slow and stubborn wounds that will not answer to anything else, and it works for reasons that would have been quite invisible to the woman with the honey pot. She knew only that honey answered, that a honeyed cloth kept a wound sweet, using that word in its old sense of unspoiled, and that a wound left to go bad without it was a far more dangerous thing. Let us turn now, before we leave the honey pot, to its close companions on the same shelf, the sugar loaf and the little jar of oxymel. Sugar in Tudor England was not the cheap and everyday thing it later became. It arrived from far away, costly and pale, kept locked in some houses and shaved from a hard cone with special nippers. And yet sugar too found its way into the dressing of wounds, packed dry into a deep and dirty sore, or boiled with honey into a stiff salve. The reason it worked is the very same reason the honey worked. Sugar, like honey, is desperately thirsty, and packed into a wound it draws the moisture out of everything, so that the small living things which would spoil the flesh cannot live in so dry a place. Here again the old practice quietly matches the new. There are clinics in our own time, in places where the newest dressings are hard to come by. That pack a deep wound with plain sugar and watch it clean itself and close, exactly as a Tudor surgeon might have done with the last of a precious loaf. The little jar of oxymel is honey again in another dress. It was nothing more than honey and vinegar boiled gently together, sometimes with herbs steeped in it, and it was one of the most reached for cough medicines of the whole age. A spoonful in warm water eased a sore throat and loosened a tight chest, and the very same mixture, stronger, was used to wash a foul wound. We know now that honey does indeed soothe a cough, gently and genuinely, and that its old use for a raw throat was no mere comfort. It is a gentle thought to hold at the start of our evening, that the sweetness a Tudor family kept for its rare pleasures, the honey for the winter cordial, and the sugar for the feast day, was also, quietly, among the truest medicines in the house. Nothing strange about it at all, once you know why. Only a very old and very patient piece of good sense, wearing a shape that startles us now. We turn now to something stranger still, and older still in the dim corners of the house. The cobweb taken down from the rafter and laid across a cut, and the curious idea that the best thing you could do for a wound was, very nearly, nothing at all. There is scarcely a folk medicine anywhere in Europe that did not, at some time, reach for the cobweb. In the Tudor cottage and the Tudor manor alike, when a cut would not stop bleeding, someone would climb to reach the grey drift of web in a high corner, gather it into a soft pad, and press it firmly over the wound. It sounds, said plainly, like one of the least clean things a person could do, taking the dust and the dead flies of a ceiling corner and pressing them into raw flesh. And yet the bleeding, under a good pad of cobweb, would very often slow and stop, and the small wound beneath would frequently heal without further trouble. The old books took it entirely for granted. Cobweb appears in receipt after receipt as a thing to staunch blood, to lay under a plaster, to bind over the place where a leech had been taken off and the small bite would not close. It was one of those remedies so common, so near to hand in every draughty house, that no herbalist felt any need to explain it. It was simply what you used when the blood came faster than a cloth could catch it, and it was there in every corner of every room, costing nothing and asking nothing. In some counties a pinch of cobweb was even rolled small and swallowed for the shaking fever they called the ague, a use we would not repeat and cannot vouch for, though it tells us how deep the trust in the cobweb ran. We turn now to the sense that hides inside it, which is a double sense. One part we understand well and one part we are only lately coming to. The first part is simple. A pad of cobweb pressed onto a wound gives the blood a fine, dense mesh to catch and clot against. A scaffold, much as a modern dressing of packed fibres does. The pressure and the tangle together help the blood do the very thing it most wants to do, which is to knot itself into a plug and seal the breach. That alone would explain a good deal of the cobweb's long reputation. But there is a second part, quieter and more surprising, which the careful study of spider silk in our own time has begun to suggest. The silk itself appears to carry, along its length, faint traces of substances that discourage the growth of certain bacteria and fungi, as though the spider, for its own reasons, keeps its web a little cleaner than the dusty corner around it. The old wives who swore by the cobweb could not have known this. They knew only that it stopped the blood, and that the wound beneath it tended to stay sound, and that was proof enough for them. Nor was the cobweb alone in this. On the heath and in the pasture grew the puffball, the round pale fungus that bursts into brown dust when it is ripe, and its dry inner flesh was carried home, cut into pads, and pressed onto wounds and the sockets of drawn teeth to stop the flow of blood. Farmers kept dried puffballs in the barn for exactly this, for themselves and for their beasts, well into much later centuries. Like the cobweb, it gave the blood a soft, dense web to clot within, and like the cobweb it was there for the taking, free and close and reliable. One of the countless small pieces of practical knowledge that every household simply held without thinking of it as knowledge at all. We turn now, before the strangest wound cure of all, to a plainer one that the better Tudor surgeons trusted above almost anything, the washing of a wound in wine. When a man was cut or run through, a careful surgeon would cleanse the wound with wine before he bound it, and the old surgical books set this down as sound and settled practice. To the eye of the age, this was simply cleanliness and good sense. The wine being clean where the water of the well or the horse trough was full. But there was more true virtue in it than they could know, for wine holds within it a mild power to check the growth of the small living things that spoil a wound, a faint natural cousin of the stronger spirits later ages would use. A wound washed in wine and then left clean was a wound given a real, if quiet, protection, and the surgeons who trusted the practice were rewarded by their results long before anyone could say why. And this throws a hard light on the ordinary wound salves of the day, and on why leaving a wound alone so often beat treating it. For the common salves and plasters that anxious hands pressed onto wounds were, as often as not, made of dreadful stuff, of old rancid grease and animal dung, and the scrapings of this and that, mixed without any thought of cleanliness and smeared on again and again with unwashed fingers. Such a salve did not help a wound. It fouled it and fed the very corruption it was meant to cure. So when a wound was merely washed in wine, bound in a clean cloth, and then let be, it was spared all of this, and it healed the better for being spared. The plain sense hidden here is the same sense that hides inside the strange weapon, salve, we come to next, and it is worth carrying gently forward. Very often the kindest thing a Tudor could do for a wound was to clean it once, cover it, and then keep their well, meaning hands away from it. Let that quiet lesson settle for a moment, for it is one of the gentlest in the whole evening. So much of what we admire in these old cures turns out to be, at bottom, a kind of wise restraint, a knowing when to stop, a trust that the body will do most of the mending, if it is only kept clean and left in peace. There is a comfort in that thought as the night deepens, that the deepest healing so often asks for nothing at all but rest and quiet and time. It is, when you think on it, very much what we are doing here ourselves tonight, doing almost nothing, keeping still, and letting the quiet do its slow and patient work. Let us turn now to the strangest wound cure of the whole age, and the one that best teaches the deepest lesson hidden in this evening. The weapon salve, and the powder of sympathy, and the wounds that healed because someone at last simply left them alone. There grew up in the later years of the Tudor age, and flowered in the years just after, a most peculiar idea, championed by the followers of the fierce Swiss physician who called himself Paracelsus. If a man was wounded by a sword or a knife, they said, then the way to heal him was not to treat the wound at all, but to treat the weapon that had made it. The blade would be carefully anointed with a salve, a strange preparation that might contain moss scraped from an old skull and the fat of a boar, and the wound itself, meanwhile, would be washed clean, bound up in a fair linen cloth, and left. A generation later, an English gentleman, Sir Kernel Digby, made himself famous by lecturing on a cousin of this cure that he called the powder of sympathy, in which the powder was applied not to the wound, but to the bloodied bandage that had come off it, sometimes while the wounded man lay a mile away. Said aloud, "This is very close to pure magic," and much of it was. Rubbing an ointment on a sword can do nothing whatever to the arm the sword has cut. And yet, and here is the thing worth carrying gently away from tonight, the patients treated this way often did remarkably well. Better, in truth, than those whose wounds were packed with the ordinary salves of the day, which were frequently made of foul and irritating stuff, of old grease and dung and crushed beetles, and applied over and over with unwashed hands. The secret of the weapon salve was that while the physician was busy anointing the weapon, the wound itself was being washed with clean water or wine, wrapped in a clean cloth, and then, above all, left undisturbed. It was being spared the very treatment that so often did the harm. The whole of the magic lay in the neglect. This is perhaps the single quietest and most important truth in the entire history of strange cures, and it runs like a thread beneath a great many of the remedies we will meet tonight. A wound kept clean, kept covered, and above all left alone to do its own patient work, will very often heal better than a wound that is fussed and poulticed and reopened a dozen times by anxious hands. The Tudors stumbled onto this sideways, dressed it up in talk of sympathy and distant powders and moss from old skulls, and could not have said why it worked. But their bodies healed all the same, quietly, beneath the clean bandage, while the learned men stood back and congratulated the salve upon the sword. Rest here a moment, if you like, before we go on. We have handled 3 strange things already, the honey pot, the cobweb, and the salved sword, and found the same simple sense curled inside each of them. Keep the wound clean. Keep it covered. Leave it be. There is nothing you need to remember. Let the words go by like the turning of the candle flame, and let us move on, gently, to the next strange cure on the shelf. Let us turn now to a cure that sounds, of all the cures on our shelf tonight, perhaps the most unpleasant, and which turned out, of all of them, to hold the greatest secret. Mouldy bread bound to a wound. Picture a labourer with a deep splinter gone bad in the ball of his thumb, the whole hand hot and swollen, the sort of small hurt that in a world without our medicines could turn dangerous within the week. The remedy his grandmother reaches for is a slice of bread, sometimes fresh and sometimes deliberately kept, until it has gone soft and green in the crock, moistened with water or a little milk, and bound over the swelling with a strip of cloth. She may leave a loaf to grow its blue-green fur in a damp corner precisely, so that it will be ready when needed. To bind rot onto an infected hand looks, to us, like the surest way to make a bad thing worse, and yet the swelling would very often ease, the poison of it drain, and the thumb come sound again. The mouldy bread poultice was not peculiar to Tudor England. It reaches back into the deepest recorded past of medicine, to the physicians of ancient Egypt who laid mouldy bread on wounds, and it turns up quietly across Europe and further east, wherever bread was made and left long enough to spoil. Healers of the ancient world, in Egypt and in the lands beyond, set down the practice in their oldest writings, laying mouldy bread and mouldy grain, and the scum of fermenting things upon sores and wounds, and the same quiet habit surfaces again and again down the centuries in the folk medicine of one country after another, in Serbia and in the Highlands, and in 100 cottage kitchens, a piece of hard-won knowledge that seems to have been discovered and forgotten and discovered again, wherever people watched their sores closely enough. That so scattered and so separate a set of peoples should all arrive at the same odd cure tells us something. It was not learned from a book passed hand to hand, for most who used it could not read, and many were divided by whole oceans and languages. It was learned instead from the wound itself, from the plain and repeated observation that a sore dressed with a certain mouldy bread sometimes did better than a sore left bare, an observation made over and over, independently, by watchful people in far apart places, and held onto because it worked often enough to be worth the keeping. There is a kind of blind, patient wisdom in that, a truth arrived at not by understanding, but by sheer attentive repetition, and it is humbling to think how close it came, so many times and in so many places, to the great discovery that would not be understood for thousands of years. In the English cottage it was a homely, half-secret thing, more often found in the memory of an old woman than written into any printed book, though it shadows the more respectable poultices of the herbals closely. It was the cure you used for a wetlow, the throbbing infection beside a fingernail, for a sty upon the eyelid, for a boil that would not come to a head, for the small festering hurts that were the constant companions of a life of hard-hand labor. We turn now to what the people who used it believed they were doing, which was not at all what they were truly doing. In the thinking of the age, a poultice was a thing that drew. A warm, wet mass bound over a swelling was understood to pull the corrupt matter out of the flesh and up into itself, the way a warm cloth seems to draw the ache out of a bruise. The mould, where anyone thought about it at all, was reckoned part of this drawing, or was simply the natural state of bread left standing, unremarkable in a world where mould grew on everything by the week's end. No one imagined that the green fur was itself a living army, waging its own quiet war. They saw only that the poultice drew, and that the hand grew better, and they were satisfied. It helps to picture the whole family of poultices, among which the mouldy bread took its place, for the Tudor household kept several and reached for whichever lay nearest. There was the plain poultice of bread and warm milk, softened to a soft mash and bound on hot. There was the bran poultice, and the poultice of boiled linseed, thick and slippery, and holding its heat a long while. There were poultices of mallow leaves, and of boiled turnip and of oatmeal, each chosen for a particular kind of swelling, and all of them working. In the mind of the age, by the same virtue of drawing, the mouldy bread was simply one member of this warm and homely company, distinguished only by the green fur that no one thought to wonder at. So ordinary was Mould in a world where nothing was sealed and everything spoiled within the week. A loaf, a cheese, a pot of preserves, all wore their coats of mould in their season. and to bind a little of it onto a sore seemed no stranger than binding on the bread beneath it. Let the thought of it rest lightly. There is nothing to hold on to here, only a warm cloth on a sore hand, and the slow patience of an old woman who has done this 100 times and expects it to answer. Let the green bread and the warm milk and the bran and the linseed all blur softly together and drift away, and let us go on gently to what the green fur was truly doing, all unseen. Now here is the sense inside it, and it is the most famous piece of hidden sense in the whole story of medicine, so we will tell it slowly. Certain moulds, and among them the blue-green moulds that most readily colonize old bread, make and give off substances that kill the very bacteria which cause a wound to fester. They do this for their own sake, to keep rival microbes from crowding their food, and in doing so they lay down, all unknowing, one of the great weapons of healing. The Tudors could not see the war, but they sometimes reaped its spoils. When the mode on the bread happened to be one of the kind ones, the poultice was not merely drawing warmth and moisture. It was flooding the wound with a faint natural medicine centuries before anyone had a name for such a thing. That name came at last in our own age, and it came, as these things so often do, half by accident. A Scottish doctor, returning to a cluttered laboratory after a summer away, found that a stray blue-green mould had drifted onto one of his dishes and cleared a bare ring around itself where the bacteria he was growing had simply died. He called the substance the mould made after the mould itself, and the word he coined has since saved more human lives than almost any other. That was in the 1920s, some 3.5 centuries after our Tudor grandmother bound her green bread onto a labouring man's thumb. She was, without knowing it, doing in the cottage kitchen a rough and hopeful version of what that doctor would one day do with his glass dishes, and what whole factories would one day do for the world. But we must tell the other half of it too, calmly and without alarm, because it matters. Not every mould is a kind one. Some of the moulds that grow on old bread and damp grain make not medicines but poisons, and a poultice of the wrong mould could do real harm. The Tudor cure was, in truth, a gamble played blind, sometimes winning and sometimes not, with no way of telling the healing green from the harmful. This is one of the cures we admire most for its hidden sense and would repeat least, and it is worth holding both of those thoughts together, gently, at the same time. The kernel of truth inside it was real and great. The blindness with which it was used was real and dangerous. Both things are true at once. There is, though, a quieter kernel here that needed no luck at all, and it is worth ending on. Set the mould aside entirely, and a warm, moist poultice of plain bread and milk, bound over a boil or an angry swelling, does genuinely help. The warmth brings blood to the place and eases the pain. The moisture softens the skin, and a boil so treated will often come to a head and drain and heal, which is exactly what it needs to do. So even when the mould was neither kind nor cruel, but simply absent, the bread poultice beneath it was sound and gentle sense. The Tudors reached, in their green bread, for two things folded together: a wild lottery they could not see, and a warm wet comfort that quietly worked on its own. Let us leave the bread crock now, and turn to something growing down by the water. Let us turn now to the willow, and to the meadowsweet that keeps it company along the wet edges of the field, and to the easing of pain and fever that both of them, quietly, could give. There is a willow tree at the bottom of nearly every English meadow, leaning over the ditch or the slow brown stream, its long leaves silvering when the wind turns them. For a Tudor household, that tree was more than shade and more than the withies its branches gave for baskets. Its bark, the grey-brown skin peeled from a young branch, was a medicine, steeped in water into a bitter drink, or simply chewed. It was taken for the headache, for the deep ache of the joints in a damp season, and above all for the fever and the shaking ague that rose from the marshes and the fenlands and returned, in some year after year. It sounds a modest thing to strip a bit of bark from a tree and steep it in water for a fever. But that modest bit of bark holds one of the true foundation stones of all the medicine that came after. Willow, like honey, was old in the cure long before the Tudors chewed it. The physicians of ancient Sumer scratched it into clay. The Egyptians wrote it on their papyrus. The Greek physicians of Hippocrates and Dioscorides knew the bark and the leaves for pain and fever. And the Anglo-Saxon leech books of England, centuries before the first Tudor was crowned, set willow down among their remedies. By the 16th century, the herbalists simply recorded what everyone already knew. William Turner, the clergyman and scholar whom later ages called the father of English botany, described the willow plainly in his new herbal in the middle of the century, and John Gerard, at its close, noted the cooling and binding virtue of its bark and leaves as settled fact. We turn now to the reason they thought it worked, which touches on one of the loveliest wrong ideas of the old medicine. In the humoral scheme, a fever was a heat, an excess of the hot and dry, and the cure for a heat was a cooling thing. The willow was reckoned cold and dry in its nature, and so it was the natural answer to a burning fever. And there was a second thread of old reasoning, quieter still, sometimes called the doctrine of signatures, the belief that a plant showed by its manner and its place of growing what it was good for. The willow grows with its feet in cold, wet ground, in exactly the damp and marshy places from which the agues and the fevers were thought to rise. A tree that thrived in the sickly damp, so the reasoning ran, must surely hold the cure for the sicknesses of the damp. It was, as a piece of logic, entirely fanciful, and it pointed, once again, straight at a remedy that truly answered. We turn now to the world of the ague itself, for it was the great and constant fever of Tudor England, and it shaped the use of the willow. Much of lowland England was then a land of marshes and fens, and undrained wet ground, and out of that wet ground rose the shivering, sweating fevers the people called the ague, coming back in their bouts every third or fourth day with a dreadful regularity, wearing a person down across whole seasons. Against these the willow tea and the meadowsweet infusion were drunk again and again, and they did genuinely ease the misery, cooling the fever and quieting the ache in the bones, so that the sufferer, though not cured, was truly comforted through the worst of a bout. It is worth saying plainly and gently that the willow could not cure the deep cause of the marsh ague, which we now know for a disease carried on the bite of the marsh gnat, and that the true cure for it would come only later, from the bark of a far-off tree of the New World. The bark the next age would call the Jesuit's bark, but to ease a fever it could not cure was no small mercy, and the willow gave that mercy freely, from the bottom of every English meadow. Settle in a little here, if you are still with me, for we are among the cooling, quieting herbs now, and there is nothing in them that asks anything of you. Let the picture of the willow leaning over its cold stream, and the frothy cream of the meadowsweet strewn across a sickroom floor, drift by as gently as the fevers they were drunk against. There is nothing here to remember, and every reason to let it all go soft and dim as the candle burns down. Meadowsweet grew in the very same wet meadows, and shared in the very same virtue, though few who used it knew the two were kin in this. It is a tall, frothy, cream-flowered herb, and its scent is one of the sweetest of the whole English summer, so sweet that it was among the most prized of all the strewing herbs, scattered thick across the floors of hall and sickroom, so that every footstep bruised it and released its almond fragrance. Gerard wrote with real warmth of how the smell of it delighted the senses and made the heart merry, and it was strewn in the chambers of the great for feasts. It was also drunk in an infusion, for fevers and for a sour and aching stomach, a second gift from the same wet ground, wearing perfume where the willow wore only bitterness. Now here is the kernel, shared between the two of them, and it is a large one. The bark of the willow holds a substance the chemists of a later age would name salicin, and the meadowsweet holds its close cousins, and when either is taken into the body it is turned, within, into an acid that genuinely eases pain, cools a fever, and quiets the heat of inflammation. This is no small folk comfort. It is the very same family of medicine that, refined and made regular in a factory, became the small white tablet that half the world now keeps in a drawer against a headache. The willow tea of the marsh cottage and that familiar tablet are branches of a single tree. The thread from the one to the other runs straight through the centuries, and it is worth following gently, for it ends in a name we all know. Long after the Tudors, an English clergyman tried the bark of the willow upon the eggs of his parish, and wrote a careful letter about how well it served. In the century after that, chemists drew the pure salicin out of the bark, and then a sharper acid out of the salicin, and found it eased pain wonderfully, but was harsh upon the stomach. And then, near the close of the 1800s, a chemist working for a German firm softened that harsh acid into a gentler form, and the medicine was named in part after the old botanical name of the meadowsweet itself. So the perfume of the strewing herb and the bitterness of the streamside bark both live on, quietly, inside a tablet swallowed 1 billion times a year, by people who have never heard of either plant. And there is a last small kernel tucked inside the kindness of the plant over the drug that is worth pausing on before we move to the next shelf. That sharp pure acid the chemists first made was hard on the belly, as we said, but the willow bark of the Tudor sickroom was gentler than the pure drug ever was, because the plant gives up its medicine slowly, a little at a time, folded in among 100 other mild substances that cushion its edge. The old bitter drink was, in its rough way, a kinder thing than the first pure medicine that came from it. There is a quiet lesson in that, about the wisdom of the whole plant, and the willow keeps it patiently at the bottom of the meadow, leaning over the water, exactly where it has always stood. Let us leave it there, and turn now towards something with a far stronger smell. Let us turn now to the pungent shelf of the Tudor kitchen, and to 3 humble bulbs that were reckoned, in their day, to be among the strongest medicines a poor family could lay hands on. Garlic and onion, and the leek. Garlic was called, in the old phrase, the poor man's treacle, and to understand the compliment, in that you must know that treacle meant the grand and costly cure, all of the apothecaries. The theriac we shall come to later in the night. To say that garlic was the treacle of the poor was to say that this cheap and common bulb, growing in any patch of ground and costing next to nothing, was believed to do for the labourer what the golden electuary in its jar did for the rich. It was eaten against the plague, chewed against worms, boiled in milk for a cough, crushed into wine for a foul wound, and hung, in some houses, over the door and around the neck of a sick child. A Tudor who saw you rubbing crushed garlic into a cut and swallowing another clove for good measure would not have thought you strange at all. He would have thought you sensible. The onion kept it close company. A whole onion, roasted soft in the embers until it was sweet and yielding, was a favourite thing to bind, still warm, against the ear of a child crying with earache, or to lay upon the chest for a deep and rattling cough. Split raw and rubbed on the skin, the onion was used for the sting of a bee and the small burn from the fire, for it was said to draw the heat out of a scald. The leek, the third of the family, went mostly into the pottage pot, but it too had its place in the medicine of the house, its juice used in wound drinks and salves, and the whole plant carried, in Wales especially, a dignity beyond the merely medical. All three were held, in the reckoning of the humours, to be hot and dry in the very highest degree, the hottest medicines in the whole garden, and so the natural weapons against the cold, damp, sluggish diseases of phlegm. It was in the plague years above all that garlic came into its full reputation, and the plague came again and again through the Tudor century, emptying streets and closing theatres and driving those who could afford it out of the crowded towns. Against it the poor, who could never dream of the golden treacle of the apothecary, ate garlic in quantity and carried cloves of it about them and hung it in their houses, trusting the sheer reek of it to keep the contagion at bay. They chewed it, they steeped it in their vinegar, they rubbed it on bread. To a great physician this was the crude physic of the ignorant, but the poor clung to their garlic through outbreak after outbreak, and it was, though no one could have proved it, a good deal better than nothing, for the bulb they trusted held a real and genuine power against the small causes of disease, even if not against the plague they most feared. Beyond the great crisis there was a quieter, daily kind of physic in these bulbs, taken not as medicine at all but as food. The leek and the onion went into the pottage pot almost every day. The thick, simmered mess of vegetables and grain, that was the true daily bread of most English households, and so a little of their virtue was eaten steadily, season upon season, by nearly everyone. The leek in particular carried a dignity beyond the pot, worn as a badge by the men of Wales, and tied by old story to their patron saint, and to a battle won with leeks in the men's caps to know friend from foe. Whether eaten for the belly or worn for pride, these humble members of the onion kind were woven so deep into ordinary life that their medicine was taken without anyone thinking of it as medicine, a slow, mild, daily dose of something genuinely good, hidden in the plainest supper on the table. We turn now to the sense inside the smell, which is real and considerable. When a clove of garlic is crushed or cut, and only then, it releases a sharp substance the chemists of our own age have studied closely, and that substance genuinely kills a wide range of the small living things that cause disease. Garlic is, in plain and modern terms, a true antibacterial and antifungal, mild but real, and the onion carries a gentler share of the same virtue. The old use of crushed garlic on a wound, or garlic steeped in wine as a wash, was not superstition. It was a rough and ready antiseptic, reached for centuries before the word antiseptic existed. And the eating of garlic against the troubles of the chest and the blood, so long a matter of pure faith, has found at least a little quiet support in the careful measurements of the laboratory, though we tell that, as we tell everything tonight, only as history and never as counsel. It is worth pausing on how neatly the old bulb fits the new understanding, for it is one of the clearer cases of an ancient faith turning out to have a true flaw beneath it. The Tudors gave garlic for wounds, for the chest, for worms, for the plague, for the sluggish blood, a scattering of uses that must have looked, to a doubter, like the usual overreaching of folk medicine. One plant claimed to cure everything and therefore, surely, curing nothing, and yet a single real property, the genuine power of the crushed clove against small living things, quietly underwrites a good part of that long list. The wound it cleaned, the worm it troubled, the chest infection it eased. The plant was not the cure all its keepers imagined, but it was a truer and broader medicine than the doubter would have granted. And the humble braid of garlic hanging by the Tudor door held more honest virtue than many a costly draught from the physician's shelf. And now let us turn gently to the loveliest proof of all that these old bulb cures held true medicine, though it comes from a book far older than the Tudors, from the deep English past that they themselves would have thought ancient. Some 600 years before Elizabeth sat on the throne, an English healer whose book we call the Leech Book of Mould wrote out a remedy for a sty or an infection of the eye. It was a strange receipt even by the standards of its own age. Take garlic and another of the onion kind, it said, and wine, and the bile from the stomach of an ox, and beat them together, and let them stand in a vessel of brass for 9 nights, and then strain the mixture through a cloth before using it upon the eye. Garlic, onion, wine, and the gall of a cow, brewed 9 nights in brass. It reads like the very picture of a witch's muddle, the sort of thing a modern reader smiles at and turns the page from. In our own century, a team of scholars and scientists in the English city of Nottingham decided to make it again, exactly as the old book directed, measuring the garlic and the wine and the ox gall with care, using true brass, waiting the full 9 nights. And when they tested the strained old brew against one of the most stubborn bacteria of the modern hospital, a germ that shrugs off many of our newest medicines, they found that it killed the germ, and killed it well, in the glass and in the dish. No single part of the receipt did this alone. The garlic alone was weak, the wine alone was weak, the bile alone was weak. It was the 4 of them together, standing the 9 nights in the brass, that made something greater than any one of them. The old healer had no way of knowing why his mixture worked, and could not have proved that it did in any way we would accept. But he had, by patient trial, assembled a thing of real and measurable power, and it waited 1,000 years in a quiet manuscript for someone to test it and be astonished. The Tudor housewife crushing garlic into wine to wash a wound was, without knowing it, doing a plainer version of that same old English magic, reaching for the sharpness of the bulb and the bite of the wine together against the corruption of a wound. It worked because of what garlic truly is, and what wine truly is, and how the two together are more than either alone. There is nothing strange in it, once the smell is understood. Only a very old and very deep vein of good sense, running back through the Tudor kitchen into the leech books of a forgotten England. Let us leave the garlic braid hanging by the door and turn to the sour jug beside it. Let us turn now to vinegar, the cheapest and most everywhere of all the medicines in the Tudor house, and to the long strange war it was made to fight against what the age called bad air. Every household had vinegar, for it was simply wine or ale that had turned sour, and nothing was ever wasted. It went into the cooking and the pickling, of course, but it went as readily into the medicine. A cloth wrung out in vinegar, and water was laid on a hot brow to cool a fever, and there was real cooling in it, for the vinegar carries the warmth away as it dries. Vinegar and water made a wash for the mouth, and for sore and bleeding gums, a gargle for a raw throat, a rinse for a wound. But the strangest and grandest use of vinegar, the one that fills the plague writings of the age, was as a shield against contagion itself, against the invisible thing that emptied whole streets in a bad summer. The people of Tudor England did not know what plague was. They believed, following the ancient teaching, that many diseases travelled on bad air, on the foul and stinking vapours that rose from middens and marshes and the breath of the sick, a poison of the air they called miasma. If disease rode on foul smells, then sharp and clean smells might drive it off, and vinegar was the sharpest cheap smell there was. So in plague time people sprinkled vinegar about their rooms, washed the very coins and letters that passed from stranger to stranger in bowls of vinegar, and carried little sponges soaked in aromatic vinegar to press to the nose in a crowded or a stricken place. The rich carried a pomander, a pierced ball of gold or silver, filled with a paste of aromatic gums and herbs, hung on a chain and lifted to the face when the air seemed dangerous. There is a later French tale, from long after the Tudors, of 4 thieves who robbed the plague dead unharmed because they had washed themselves in a vinegar steeped with herbs. And though the tale is a legend, it caught something the Tudors already half believed, that a sharp herbade vinegar kept the sickness at arm's length. We turn now to the double kernel hidden inside all this sprinkling and sniffing, for there are 2 true things folded into the false theory, and both are worth the telling. The first is the plainer. Vinegar is a genuine mild disinfectant, and always was. Washing the hands, the coins, the letters, the surfaces of a sick room in vinegar truly did reduce the germs upon them, though no one knew that germs were the thing being reduced. In fighting the imaginary poison of the air, the vinegar was quietly killing a portion of the real and living cause of much everyday disease. The instinct to clean, even dressed in the wrong reason, cleaned all the same. The second kernel is stranger and more wonderful, and it turns on the plague itself. The plague was carried, we now know, chiefly by the fleas that lived upon the black rat, and in the worst outbreaks, upon people too. The aromatic herbs and vinegars that the Tudors pressed to their faces and hung about their rooms, the lavender and the rue and the wormwood and the rest, are exactly the kinds of sharp-scented plants that fleas and lice and biting insects most dislike and most avoid. So the man who filled his pomander with strong herbs to keep off the bad air was, without the faintest idea of it, filling it with the very things that keep off the flea that carried his death. The false shield against the vapor was, by pure accident, a real and partial shield against the insect. It did not save everyone, and it was never enough on its own. But it was not nothing, and the wonder of it is that they were right about the herbs for entirely the wrong reason. This is why the floors of every hall and cottage were strewn thick with cut herbs, a practice we might take for mere sweetening of a stale room, and which was that, but was quietly more. Rushes and lavender, wormwood and tansy, meadowsweet, and the herb they aptly called fleabane, were scattered across the floor to be crushed underfoot and give up their scent. In a world that thought disease came from bad smells, this was medicine, a daily fumigation of the home against the miasma. In the world as it truly is, it was a steady, low, unnoticed war against the fleas and the lice and the moths that shared the Tudor floor, waged with nothing but the oils of bruised herbs. A record of a great house in plague, time notes the buying of quantities of such herbs to strew and to burn, the smoke of them drifting through the rooms, the household breathing easier for a reason they misnamed but a benefit that was real. There is one more quiet proof of vinegar's true power, and it stood in plain sight on every shelf in the house, in the crocks and jars of pickled things. The same sour liquid that people sprinkled against the bad air was also the great preserver of food, and a cucumber or an onion or a piece of meat laid down in vinegar would keep sound and wholesome through the long winter when fresh food failed. No one knew why the pickle kept, only that it did, and that food left out of the vinegar spoiled, while food within it stayed good. But the reason was the very same reason the vinegar cleaned a wound and a sick room, for the sharp acid of it holds off the small, living things that make food rot exactly as it holds off the small, living things that make a wound fester. So the vinegar jug was quietly fighting corruption in two places at once, on the larder shelf and in the sick bed, by one and the same true and unseen power. And the Tudors leaned on both, without ever guessing they were the same. As for the pomander held to the face, the rich carried theirs in pierced gold and silver on a chain, and the poor carried instead a simple posy of strong herbs, a bunch of rue and lavender and wormwood clutched in the hand and lifted to the nose whenever a stricken street had to be crossed. In a later age, past the Tudors, the physicians who dared to visit plague houses would go masked in a great beak stuffed full of these same aromatic herbs, breathing through the crushed sweetness of them as through a filter. Grand or humble, gold or a fistful of garden herbs, all of it reached for the same shield of scent, and all of it, for reasons none of them understood, was a little more than the empty gesture it seemed, keeping off, along with the imagined poison of the air, the small biting things that carried the real one. Let us leave the sour jug and the strewn floor now, and turn to a jar on the still room shelf whose making would try the patience of anyone, the water of snails. Let us turn now to one of the most patient and peculiar preparations in the whole Tudor still room, a remedy that asked its maker for a great deal of quiet labor and a strong stomach both, the water of snails. To understand snail water, you must first picture the making of it, for the making is half the strangeness. On a damp morning the household children, were sent out along the walls and the hedge bottoms, and the cabbage bed to gather snails, the common garden kind, and to gather a great many, for a good receipt might call for a whole peck of them, more than would fill a large bowl. These were brought in and washed, sometimes in beer or oil, sometimes rubbed with salt and bran to cleanse them, and then, shells and all, they were bruised and crushed together, often with a handful of garden earthworms scarred clean, and set into the great glass or copper still with milk, with herbs, with a little white wine, and gently distilled over the fire until a clear, faintly sweet water dripped from the beak of the alembic into the waiting jar. That clear water, drawn from crushed snails and worms and milk and herbs, was snail water, and it was kept as one of the most treasured remedies a careful woman could make. It was given, above all, for the wasting sicknesses, for what the age called consumption and a decline, the slow diseases in which a person, often a young one, grew thinner and weaker and coughed the months away. A cup of snail water, warmed and sweetened, was pressed on such a patient morning and evening, and on weak children who would not thrive, and on nursing mothers whose strength was failing. And it was valued, too, for the skin and the complexion, smoothed onto rough or blemished faces, dabbed on sore and reddened eyes, used to soften and mend the outer surface of a person as much as to strengthen the inner. The receipt books of Tudor and early Stuart gentlewomen copy it out again and again, each in her own spelling, each sure that her mother's version was the best. A remedy handed woman to woman across the generations with real and settled faith. We turn now to why they trusted it in the thinking of their time. A wasting disease was understood as a drying and a heating, a person burning up and shriveling like a leaf, and the cure for a hot, dry decline was a cold and moist and nourishing thing. What could be cooler and moister and more soothing than the cool, slick body of a snail, gliding on its own soft moisture? The very slime that makes us recoil was, to the Tudor eye, the plain visible sign of the snail's moistening, balsamic, healing virtue, a substance that coated and calmed and cooled a raw and burning surface. It was, in their logic, the perfect answer to a fever that was eating a person from within, and the perfect balm for a skin worn rough and dry. The snail water lived, above all, in the handwritten receipt books of the gentlewomen who ran the great and middling houses, and it is worth pausing on that quiet world of women's knowledge for a moment. These books were not printed. They were kept in a careful hand, added to across a lifetime, and handed down from mother to daughter as among the most precious things a woman owned, thick with cures and cookery and household craft all mingled together. A good receipt for snail water might be copied out of a cousin's book by candlelight, sent from one house to another, folded inside a letter, praised and compared and quietly improved. Each woman sure her own version was the surest. Behind every jar of the finished water lay real and patient labor. The children sent out to gather the snails, the long washing and cleansing, the hours of tending the still while the clear water dripped. And behind that again lay a whole invisible network of women trading their knowledge across the years, the true keepers of the household's health. Rest here a moment, if you like, and let the strangeness of it soften. There is nothing you need to make of the crushed snails and the dripping still, only a picture to drift upon. A woman in a stone-floored still room on a grey morning, tending her quiet fire, making from the humblest creatures of her garden a medicine she believed with all her heart would help someone she loved. The belief was warm and real, whatever the snails could or could not do, and it is the belief, as much as the water, that we are turning over gently in the candlelight tonight. There was, besides the sick-room use, the matter of the complexion, and here the snail water found its steadiest place. The age prized a smooth and unblemished skin, and a woman troubled by roughness or redness, or the marks of an old illness, would smooth the cool, distilled water onto her face morning and evening, patiently, across the weeks, and swear that it answered. This was the use that has come round most fully into our own time, and the one the Tudors were most right about, for the slick of the snail, so long distilled for vanity, as much as for health, holds within it exactly the substances that soothe and renew a rough or weathered skin. And now here is the strange truth that has come round again in our own time, and it belongs mostly to the skin, the slime of the snail. The very secretion the Tudors distilled, and the modern eye finds so unappealing, is genuinely and measurably good for the skin, and is prized for it today under a polite name on the labels of costly creams. It carries within it the same allantoin we shall meet again in the Comfrey, a substance that helps skin cells to grow and mend. It carries mild acids that smooth and renew the surface, and proteins that hold in moisture, and faint natural substances that discourage the small germs of the skin. A woman smoothing snail water onto a chapped face was doing, in her rough distilled way, something not so very far from what a person does today, reaching for a jar that lists snail secretion among its ingredients. The old use for the complexion was not folly at all. It was a real cosmetic and healing virtue, seen clearly, named wrongly, and rediscovered 4 centuries later. For the wasting diseases within, we must be gentler and more honest, for there the kernel is smaller. Snail water could not cure consumption, which we now know for a deep and stubborn disease of the lungs, and no distilled snail ever mended a ruined lung. But the drink was not entirely empty even so. It was warm, it was made with nourishing milk. It was given with love and attention and quiet ceremony to a frightened patient, and in an age with so little else to offer the dying and the failing. That warmth and that nourishment and that tender attention were not nothing. They eased where they could not cure, and the snail itself, though it could not heal the lung, carried substances that soothed a raw throat and a coughing chest, much as the honeyed cordials did. Set beside the hopeless, snail water was a small and gentle mercy, and it is easy to forgive the faith the Tudors placed in it. It was not alone, this cure drawn from a creature rather than a plant. The still room kept a whole quiet shelf of animal remedies beside its herbs. An oil in which earthworms had been steeped was rubbed on aching and rheumatic joints. Small grey woodlice, the pill bugs that curl beneath a damp stone, were swallowed whole or crushed into wine for the jaundice and the gravel, on the reasoning that their sharp mineral nature would cut the stony trouble within. These sit at the very edge of what we can find sense in, and we will not press them hard tonight. But the snail, at least, has come round fully into the light again, its slow secretion honoured now on the dressing table as the Tudors honoured it in the sick room. Let us leave the alembic dripping and turn to a cure that troubles the modern stomach even more than the snail, and holds, even so, a truth our own surgeons have taken up again: the maggot in the wound, Let us turn now to the maggot, and to the strange and well-founded practice of letting the smallest of scavengers do the cleaning of a wound. This is a cure the Tudors and their surgeons met more often by accident than by design, on the battlefield and in the crowded infirmary, where a wound might lie open for days in the summer heat and become, as the old phrase had it, fly-blown, filled with the pale wriggling maggots of the blowfly. Every instinct says that this is corruption itself, the wound rotting, the man as good as lost. And yet the sharp-eyed surgeons of the age noticed something that ran clean against the instinct. A wound that had become fly-blown often did better, not worse. The rotten matter cleared, the swelling and the stink eased, and beneath the maggots the flesh was frequently found to be cleaner and pinker, and more ready to heal than the flesh of a wound left maggot-free. It was a thing observed and quietly used, long before anyone could say why. The great figure here is not English but French, and he belongs entirely to the Tudor century. A barber surgeon named Ambroise Paré, who rose to serve the kings of France and changed the whole art of surgery by trusting his eyes over his books. Paré wrote of maggots in wounds among his careful observations, but his deepest lesson, and the one that shines a light over this whole evening, came from a night at the siege of a northern town, when he was still young and following the received wisdom of the day. That wisdom held that wounds from gunshot were poisoned, and must be seared shut with oil boiled scalding hot, a treatment as terrible as it sounds. One long day the wounded came in such numbers that Paré ran out of boiling oil, and in desperation he dressed the remaining men. Instead, with a gentle salve he mixed himself of egg yolk, oil of roses, and turpentine, and sent them to rest. He could not sleep that night, he tells us, fearing that the men he had not cauterized would be dead of poison by morning, that his failure of oil had killed them. He rose before dawn and went among them, and he found that the men treated with his gentle salve were resting easy, their wounds cool, their pain slight, while the men whose wounds he had seared with boiling oil lay feverish and swollen and racked with pain. From that hour, Paré wrote, he resolved never again so cruelly to burn poor men wounded by gunshot. It is one of the quietest turning points in the history of healing, and its lesson is the same soft lesson we found in the weapon salve. The gentler treatment, the one that did less harm, the one that let the wound be, was the better treatment. God heals, Paré liked to say, and the surgeon only dresses the wound. He had learned to get out of the body's way. It is worth staying a little with Paré, for he is one of the gentle giants of this whole history, and his story is a quiet rebuke to every physician who ever loved his theory more than his patient. He had risen from the humblest beginnings, a barber surgeon who learned his craft not in the universities, which he could not enter, but on the battlefields and in the wards, watching, always watching, and trusting what his own eyes told him over what the ancient books insisted. He wrote his great works plainly, in French rather than the learned Latin, so that ordinary surgeons could read them. And everywhere in them runs the same humility, the same willingness to say that he did not know, the same refusal to torment a patient for the sake of a doctrine. That a man of such tenderness should also be the one who watched the maggots at their work and understood not to wash them heedlessly away is no accident. The same patience that spared his gunshot patients the boiling oil let him see the small scavengers for the quiet allies they were, and the seeing did not end with him. Long after the Tudors, the surgeons of later wars noticed the very same thing, again and again, upon their own crowded and desperate fields. A wound that had lain open and become fly-blown so often did better than its neighbours that a surgeon of the last century at last brought the maggots deliberately into the clean hospital, raised them carefully, and set them to work on wounds that would heal by no other means, and so gave the ancient observation a proper modern home. Each generation of watchers, from the Tudor battlefield to the modern ward, saw the same plain fact that the instinct fought so hard to deny, that the smallest of scavengers cleans a wound more gently and more surely than the sharpest steel. We turn now to the true sense inside the maggot, which our own age has drawn out fully and even taken up again. The maggot of certain flies, and the blowfly is one, eats only dead and rotting flesh and will not touch living tissue. Set loose upon a foul wound, it does with exquisite delicacy what a surgeon's knife does clumsily. It eats away the dead and corrupt matter, and leaves the healthy flesh untouched and clean. More than that, the maggot bathes the wound as it feeds in secretions that kill many of the bacteria there and seem to coax the living flesh toward healing. It is, in short, a living instrument of the most precise wound cleaning imaginable, and it costs nothing and needs no steel. So exactly is this true that in our own hospitals, after long neglect, the maggot has been brought carefully back. Surgeons raise sterile maggots of the right kind and apply them, sealed under a dressing, to wounds that will not heal by any other means, to the slow ulcers of the old and the ill, and watch them cleaned and turned toward recovery, as no ointment could manage. The practice has a proper name now, and a place in the modern hospital, and it is, stripped of its strangeness, the very same thing the Tudor surgeon saw at work in the fly-blown wound, and was wise enough not to wash away. The instinct to recoil is strong, and we need not overcome it tonight, but the sense inside the strangeness is as sound as any in this whole evening. The maggot cleans what the surgeon cannot, and the Tudors, watching closely, understood enough to let it. Let us leave the wound clean and quiet now, and turn from the cleaning of hurts to the mending of them, and to a great rough-leaved herb the country people called by the plainest of names, the knitbone. Let us turn now to the great healer of broken places, the tall, rough-leaved herb that grew by every Tudor stream and ditch, and that the country people named, with their usual plainness, the knitbone. Comfrey is not a delicate plant. It stands broad and coarse and hairy, its big leaves rasping to the touch, its stems thick, its flowers hanging in soft curls of dull purple or cream, and beneath the ground it holds a black-skinned root, fat as a small turnip, that oozes a clear, slick sap when it is cut. It grows in the damp, along the water's edge and the shaded ditch and the wet corner of the meadow, spreading in generous clumps that come back thicker every year. And of all the plants a Tudor household kept close for the mending of hurts, none was trusted more completely for the deepest hurts of all, the broken bone, the wrenched joint, the deep and blackening bruise. Its country names tell the whole of its reputation in a breath. Knitbone, bonset, bruisewort, consound from an old word for making sound and whole again. The use of it was as plain as the plant. When a limb was broken or badly sprained, the root was dug and grated fine and beaten with a little water into a thick grey paste. and this was packed all around the injured place and bound firm with cloth. And here is the part that seems, at first, like pure country invention. As the comfrey paste dried, it set. It hardened over the hours into something close to a light cast, a firm shell that held the broken bone still while it mended beneath. The very thing a modern surgeon achieves with plaster. The bruised fresh leaves, laid on directly, served for the lesser troubles, the sprains and the swellings, and the deep soreness that followed a fall from a horse or a cart. Every herbal of the age set comfrey down among the first of the wound and bone herbs, and its use runs back unbroken to the ancient Greek writers, who gave it a name meaning simply to grow together. That old Greek name, and the old Latin one that meant much the same, to make sound and whole, followed the plant faithfully down all the centuries into the Tudor herbals of Turner and Gerard, who set down its virtues for the broken and the bruised as settled and unarguable fact. In practice, Comfrey belonged above all to the village bone setter, that quietly skilled figure, often a woman, who could feel a broken bone back into its place and knew, by long experience, how to hold it there while it mended. Once the bone was set, the grated comfrey paste was packed thick all around the limb and bound, and renewed as it dried and cracked over the following days, holding the mend steady week by week, much as a modern cast holds it. Households that valued the herb grew a clump of it deliberately by the door or the ditch, where it would come up faithfully every spring, so that it was always to hand when a child felled from a tree, or a man came home from the field with a wrenched and swelling joint. It was among the most dependable of all the garden's medicines, and the confidence with which the old writers named it Knitbone was earned over a great many mended arms. There are anecdotes enough of its working. A physician travelling through the country districts might record, with a touch of surprise, that a village bone setter had brought a bad break sound again, with nothing but comfrey and patience, achieving with the grey paste what his own careful splinting could barely better. Such a note, set down by a man with every reason to prefer his own learned craft, is worth more than a whole page of country boasting, for it is the reluctant testimony of a rival. Let the picture of it settle gently. An old bone setter's stained and careful hands, a bowl of grey comfrey paste, a frightened child growing calm as the pain is eased, and the slow, quiet, reliable mending that followed. There is nothing here to hold on to, only a very old kindness done well. We turn now to why it truly worked, for here the old faith and the new knowledge stand very close together. Comfrey root and leaf are rich in a substance the chemists later named allantoin, and allantoin genuinely quickens the growth and healing of cells, the knitting of skin, and the mending of the tissue around a break. This is not folklore. It is measurable, and it is the reason comfrey creams and ointments still sit on the shelves of the herbalist and the chemist today, sold for exactly the bruises and sprains the Tudors used them for. The old name Knitbone was not a hopeful boast. It was an accurate description of a real virtue, seen clearly by people who had watched a great many broken arms mend beneath the grey paste, and had learned to trust what they saw. The thick mucilage that set the paste hard was true, and the allantoin that mended the flesh was true, and the plant did, quietly and reliably, much of what its bold names promised. There is a shadow to the comfrey, though, and honesty asks that we name it calmly as history. Comfrey was also drunk, in the old days, as a tea and a syrup for coughs and inner ulcers and troubles of the chest, taken freely and for long stretches. We have learned, in our own time, that comfrey taken inwardly in this way, over months and years, can harm the liver, for it holds certain substances that the body does not easily forgive. So this is a herb whose outward use has proved sound and is honoured still, while its old inward use is one we now understand better and treat with much greater care. The Tudors could not have known the difference. They saw only that comfrey mended, and used it inside and out with the same trust. We hold their outward wisdom and set gently aside their inward habit, and in that small parting we can see the whole shape of what tonight is about, keeping the kernel and letting go the husk. There is a small wonder worth pausing on in the setting of the comfrey paste, for it is a rare thing to find a plant that mends both the flesh and the frame at once. The thick clear mucilage that oozes from the cut root is what dries into that firm shell around a broken limb, a natural cast made of nothing but the plant's own slick sap and a little water, and beneath that shell the allantoin does its quiet work upon the living tissue. So the one humble root offered both halves of the treatment a broken bone truly needs, the holding still and the healing, the splint and the medicine, drawn from a single clump by the ditch. It is easy to see why a household that had watched it work would grow it faithfully, and why the plain name Knitbone clung to it down all the centuries without anyone ever thinking to question whether it was earned. Comfrey did not stand alone among the mending herbs, and the household knew several of its lesser cousins. There was woundwort, whose very name declared its work, its leaves bound on cuts and used, John Gerard tells us, to heal a countryman who had gashed himself badly with a scythe, mended so well that Gerard set the whole tale down with evident pleasure. There was self-heal, a small low plant of the lawn and the meadow, with a hooded blue flower, called self-heal and heal all, and the carpenter's herb, kept for the cuts and knocks of those who worked with edged tools, and steeped into a wash for sore mouths and throats. And there was the root the old writers called sealwort, or Solomon's seal, dug and pounded and laid upon a black and bruised eye, or a bruised limb, to take the discoloring and the swelling down, a use so specific and so widely recorded that it can hardly have been mere fancy. Each of these carried its own small share of the same astringent, soothing, tissue-mending virtue, and together they made a quiet green company of menders, gathered along the same wet ditch and the same shaded bank as the Knitbone itself. Let us leave the streamside now and step onto the path, where the very commonest weed underfoot was also one of the surest cures in the parish. Let us turn now to three plants so common that a Tudor would have trodden on all of them between the door and the gate, and yet trusted every one for the small hurts of an ordinary day. Plantain and the marigold and yarrow. Begin with plantain, the plainest weed in England, the flat rosette of ribbed leaves that grows in every path and yard and trampled place, sending up its slender green spikes to be mown down and spring again. It is so humble that we scarcely see it now. But to the Tudors it was waybread, the bread of the wayside, one of the most reached for wound herbs there was, and its fame ran back into the deepest English past, for it stands among the 9 sacred herbs of an Anglo-Saxon healing charm centuries older than the Tudors, praised there as the mother of herbs, open to the east, mighty within. When a child was stung by a nettle or a bee, or scraped a knee raw on a stone, the nearest grown-up would pluck a plantain leaf, bruise it between the fingers or chew it soft, and press it to the hurt, and the sting would ease and the small wound settle. Even the poets knew it. In one of his plays, Shakespeare has a character recommend nothing better than a plantain leaf for a broken shin. A small, everyday joke that could only land because every soul in the audience already knew the leaf and its use by heart. The plantain's fame reached back far beyond the Tudors, into the deepest roots of English healing. It stands among the 9 holy herbs of an Anglo-Saxon charm many centuries older than the Tudor age. Honoured there under its old name of Waybroad, the broad herb of the way, and praised as the mother of herbs, mighty against poison, and against the things that creep across the land. For 1,000 years and more it had been the plant you reached down for, without breaking stride, when something small went wrong on a journey or in a field. A sting, a blister, a thorn to be drawn, a scrape to be soothed, that so humble and so trodden a weed should carry so long and so honoured a memory, tells you how deeply its plain usefulness was felt by the people who walked barefoot and shudder alike upon it. The marigold, meanwhile, earned its place in the pot, as well as the medicine chest, for its golden petals were dried by the handful and dropped into broths and stews, both to colour them a rich gold and to comfort the one who ate, so that it was sometimes called the poor man's saffron, giving the look of that costly spice at no cost at all. A good housewife dried a store of the petals every autumn against the winter, when they went into the sick man's broth and the salve pot alike. And Yarrow carried its own train of country, law beside its serious work, tucked under the pillow or drawn through the nose in old rhymes of love and divination, its power to stop blood so plain and so reliable that it gathered legend to itself as surely as it gathered the blood of Achilles' soldiers before the walls of Troy. 3 common weeds, each trodden underfoot, each pulled up as a nuisance by the careless, and every one of them wrapped in centuries of use and story and genuine, tested virtue. The marigold we call calendula was the second, glowing gold in the same dooryard, where the plantain crept underfoot. Its bright orange and yellow flowers opened through most of the growing year, asking almost nothing of the gardener, and the household prized them above nearly every other flower for the mending of the skin. The petals were worked into a soft salve with rendered fat or beeswax and spread over cuts and burns and the raw, chapped hands of winter, and a weak infusion of them was given for an unsettled stomach, and the dried flowers were dropped into broth to comfort someone recovering slowly from a long illness. It was a gentle, forgiving plant, so reliable in its flowering that it was often the very first herb a young girl was taught to grow and gather and prepare on her own, a safe thing to practice on before she was trusted with anything sharper. Yarrow was the third, and the fiercest fighter of the 3, for yarrow was the herb that stopped blood. It grows along every field edge and roadside, its flat white flower heads standing over feathery leaves, and those leaves, bruised and packed into a wound, staunch a flow of blood as few other common plants can. Its very names are a battle roll: soldier's woundwort, staunchweed, the nosebleed herb, and its oldest name of all ties it to the Greek hero Achilles, who was said to have carried it to stop the bleeding of his wounded soldiers before the walls of Troy. A Tudor haymaker who opened his hand on a blade would reach for yarrow as readily as for a cloth, and a woman would keep it dried for the same purpose through the winter. Yarrow was also brewed into a hot tea to bring on a sweat and break a fever, drunk under the blankets to sweat a chill away, a second and gentler use folded in beside its bloody first. We turn now, briefly, to the sense inside all three, for it is real, and it is much the same. Plantain holds substances that are astringent, that draw a wound tight, that quiet inflammation and discourage the germs of a small hurt, and modern study has found in it exactly the soothing, mildly antiseptic virtue that generations of stung and scraped children felt on their own skin. The marigold likewise holds true wound healing and inflammation calming substances, which is precisely why calendula creams and salves are made and sold and used to this day for the same complaints. And yarrow carries a substance, named long after for the plant itself, that genuinely helps the blood to clot, along with others that calm inflammation, so that its ancient name, as the staunch weed of Achilles, rests on a solid and demonstrable foundation. 3 weeds of the common path, trodden underfoot and pulled up as nuisances by the careless, and every one of them a true and tested medicine, free for the taking to anyone who knew their faces. There is a whole philosophy of the Tudor cottage in that, the knowledge that the cure for the day's small hurts was already growing, unbidden and unregarded, between the door and the gate. Let us leave the path now, and turn from the hurts of the skin to the troubles that hide within, and to the bitter herbs kept for the worm and the sour and sluggish belly. Let us turn now from the hurts of the skin and the mending of bones to the troubles that hide within, out of sight, and to the fiercely bitter herbs the Tudors kept for the worm and for the sour and sluggish belly. It is easy to forget, from the comfort of our own age, how constant a companion the worm was to a Tudor family. Bad water, close living with animals, and food that was often less than clean meant that most people, and above all most children, carried worms within them for much of their lives, and the trouble of it, the wasting, the swollen belly, the restless nights, was a plain and familiar part of raising a child. Against this quiet, universal affliction the household reached, again and again, for the bitterest things that grew on a simple and enduring principle, that what tasted vile to a person might taste far worse to the worm. The bitterest of them all, and the one whose very name became a byword for bitterness, was wormwood. It is a grey-green, feathery-leaved plant of the waste ground and the garden edge, silvered all over as though dusted with ash. And to taste even a little of it is to understand at once why the old writers reached for it, whenever they wanted an image of the harshest thing the tongue could bear. As bitter as wormwood, they said, and meant it. The plant carried the worm in its own English name for the plainest of reasons, for its chief and most trusted use was to drive the worm out of the belly of a suffering child, given in a bitter infusion or a syrup sweetened, just enough to be swallowed. But wormwood was not a one-purpose herb, and the household found a dozen uses for so strong a plant. Its bitterness made it a favorite for stirring a poor appetite and settling a sour and heavy stomach, taken in small amounts before a meal to wake the sluggish belly. It was steeped into oil to make the sharp drink the old writers called pearl, taken as a tonic and a comfort against the cold. Its silvery branches were laid among stored woolens and books to keep the moth and the bookworm away, and strewn on the floor against fleas, so that a single plant served the belly, the allarhouse, the linen chest, and the swept floor all at once. Small wonder that it grew by so many Tudor doors. There was a whole gentle season given over to these bitter herbs, and it came round with the spring. It was an old and widespread belief that the blood grew thick and foul over the long dark months of winter, clogged by the heavy salted diet of the cold season, and that the turning of the year was the time to cleanse it. So as the first green came up, the household took its bitter spring tonics, its wormwood owl and its dishes of bitter early greens, nettle tops and dandelion and the rest, gathered and eaten expressly to purge and freshen the sluggish winter body. Here the kernel is real and rather touching, for the winter diet truly was poor and lacking. Month upon month of salted meat and stored grain, with almost nothing fresh, and the first bitter greens of spring genuinely restored what that long diet had drained away, bringing back to a weakened body exactly the goodness it had been starved of. The people who ate their bitter spring salad to cleanse the blood were doing something quietly and deeply sound, mending a real winter want with the first gift of the returning year. Wormwood served the household in stranger ways too. Its bitter juice was stirred into ink, it was said, to keep the mice from gnawing precious manuscripts and account books, and it was steeped into the sharp, warming drink called pearl that a labouring man took against the cold and the damp. Let these small uses drift by as lightly as the rest. There is nothing here to gather up and keep, only the picture of a silvery grey plant by a cottage door, bitter beyond bearing, and useful in a dozen quiet ways to the people who had learned, across long generations, exactly what it could do. Its near cousin, the tansy, stood close beside it in the same rough ground, tall and stiff, with flat golden button flowers and a dark, aromatic, bitter leaf. Tansy carried a curious double life, half medicine and half custom. It was a worm herb like the wormwood, given in the same bitter way for the same purpose, but it was also folded into food, most famously into the little cakes and puddings called tansies that were eaten at Easter, coloured green and sharpened with the herb's bitter juice. There was old religious symbolism woven into this, the bitter herbs of the spring feast recalling the bitter herbs of an older Passover. But there was practical sense in it too, a bitter spring tonic and worm cure taken as a seasonal treat, medicine disguised as a holiday cake. Tansy also grew thickly in churchyards, and was thought to keep the worm from the buried, as it kept the worm from the living, a grim and quiet piece of folk reasoning. For the most stubborn cases, the apothecary could offer something stronger and stranger still, a small dusty seed brought from far away, that the trade called worm seed, gathered from yet another of the same bitter family of plants. This worm seed was among the most powerful worm medicines of the old world, reserved for when the homely wormwood and tansy had failed, and it points us straight toward the true sense, hidden inside this whole bitter shelf. For the reason these herbs worked was no fancy at all. They carry within them sharp substances, and one in particular drawn from the worm seed, that genuinely stun and kill the worms of the human gut. That substance, purified, went on to become a real and widely used worm medicine in the centuries after the Tudors, given to children the world over well into modern times before gentler drugs replaced it. The old herbals were right, in the plainest possible way. The bitter herb did indeed kill the worm. there is a quiet satisfaction in following that thread all the way through, from the Tudor mother spooning a bitter draught into a reluctant child, to the pharmacy of a much later age, drawing the same power out in pure and measured form, to the gentler medicines that at last replaced them both. It is one long unbroken line of the same true knowledge, refined and refined again, but never abandoned, because at the root of it lay a plain fact the old herbals had grasped correctly, that certain bitter plants hold within them a genuine death to the worm. The husk of wrong theory around it, the talk of corrupt phlegm and hot dry natures, has all been quietly let go. The kernel, the bitter herb that truly answered, has been kept and carried forward across the centuries, which is exactly the shape of the whole evening story, told once more in miniature over a sleeping child and a cup of bitter tea. We turn now, as honesty requires, to the shadow across these bitter cures, and it is the same shape of shadow we found on the Comfrey. The very strength that made wormwood and tansy kill the worm made them dangerous in too great a measure. The bitter substance in wormwood, taken to excess, is a poison to the person as well as to the worm, and the strong spirit later flavored with wormwood earned a dark reputation for exactly this reason. Tansy, taken heavily, was harsher still and could do real harm, particularly to a woman with child, a fact the old books did not always know or heed. So these are cures whose kernel of truth is beyond doubt. They killed the worm, and whose measure was perilous, for the line between the dose that cured and the dose that harmed was thin and unmarked. We admire the knowledge and wince at the risk, and hold both together, as we have learned to do tonight. There is a gentler kernel here too, though, one with no shadow on it at all, and it belongs to the sour and sluggish belly rather than the worm. When the Tudors took a little bitter wormwood before a heavy meal to wake a poor appetite and ease digestion, they were reaching for something our own understanding fully supports. A bitter taste on the tongue genuinely stirs the whole machinery of digestion into readiness, wakes the flow of the juices that break down food, and rouses a sluggish appetite. This is why, to this day, people take a bitter draught before dinner to sharpen the appetite, and a bitter cordial after it to settle the stomach. The whole cheerful tradition of the bitter aperitif and the herbal digestive is the direct descendant of the Tudor cup of wormwood all, and it rests on a real and simple physiology. In stirring the appetite with bitterness, the good wife was practicing sound medicine that needed no luck and carried no danger, and did for her family precisely what she believed it did. Let us leave the bitter shelf now, with its worm cures and its tonics, and turn to the trouble that sits, not in the belly, but higher up, in the aching head. Let us turn now to the aching head, to what the Tudors called the megrim, and to the quiet herbs they kept against it. The headache was as old, and as common then as it is now, and the worst kind, the blinding, throbbing, sickening megrim that we call the migraine, was known and dreaded under that very name, come down to them through the French from an old Greek word for a pain that gripped half the head. The Tudors understood its cause in their own way, as a rising of thick vapours or hot humours into the head, a fume that clouded the brain and set it throbbing, and against this they reached for herbs believed to clear the head and cool the fume. Chief among them, planted by many a cottage door for exactly this, was the little daisy-flowered herb they called featherfew, which we know as feverfew. Feverfew is a small bushy plant with pale, feathery, strong-smelling leaves and a scatter of tiny white daisy flowers, and its use against the headache was as direct as could be. A few of the bitter leaves were eaten, chewed slowly or folded into a morsel of bread and butter to blunt the sharp taste, taken not so much to cure a headache already come, as to keep the megrim from returning at all, day after day, as a steady guard. The old writers set it down for the head above all, though they used it too for fevers, from which its later English name was drawn, and for the troubles of women. It was one of those plain, reliable, undramatic herbs that a person who suffered from the megrim came to depend upon quietly across the years. And here the kernel is unusually clear and unusually modern, for feverfew is one of the old herbs that our own age has studied with real care and found, to a good degree, sound. The plant holds a substance the chemists named after it, and the careful trials of recent decades have found that people who take feverfew steadily, just as the Tudors chewed their daily leaf, do often suffer fewer of the blinding megrims than they otherwise would. It is not a certain cure, and it does not answer for everyone, but the old, patient, preventive use of the daily leaf turns out to rest on something real, measured now in the clinic much as it was once measured in the long experience of a suffering household. The feverfew by the door was doing, in its plain way, close to what its keepers hoped. There is something restful in the very manner of the cure, and worth dwelling on as our own evening slows. It was not a dramatic remedy, snatched up in a crisis. It was the small daily leaf, taken quietly and faithfully across the years, a steady, undramatic guarding against a trouble that might otherwise return. So much of the best of this old medicine was like that, patient and slow and undramatic, a matter of small steady kindnesses done to the body day after day rather than any single sudden rescue. Let that gentle rhythm settle over you now. The rhythm of the daily leaf and the quiet habit, as far from urgency as anything could be, and let your own breathing fall in with it, slow and even and unhurried, as the head herbs would have wished. Beside the feverfew in the Tudor esteem stood a herb we scarcely think of now, but which their age ranked among the most precious of all, wood betony. So high was its reputation that an old saying, older even than the Tudors, and passed down from the physicians of ancient Rome, urged a person to sell his coat and buy betony. So worth the having was it. It was credited with an astonishing range of virtues, but above all it was the herb of the head and the nerves, taken in an infusion for the headache, for giddiness, for frayed and anxious spirits, for the low and troubled mind, and wern, in more superstitious use, as a charm against fearful dreams and ill fortune. It grew in the woods and the shady banks, a modest spike of soft purple flowers, carrying a fame out of all proportion to its plain appearance. The kernel inside the betony is smaller and harder to weigh than the feverfews, and honesty asks that we say so gently. Betony holds mild, astringent, and calming substances, and there is a modest, real basis for its old use to settle the nerves and ease a tension headache. But much of its towering reputation was reputation itself, the accumulated faith of many centuries piled upon a herb of genuine but modest virtue. It is a fair example of something we meet often in the old herbals, a plant valued somewhat beyond its proven worth, carried high by tradition and hope as much as by chemistry. That is no shame to it. A calm, mildly soothing herb, taken with faith for a nervous headache in an anxious hour, may well have eased more heads than its plain chemistry alone can account for the quiet and the ceremony and the belief were part of the medicine too. Let us turn, last of the head herbs, to rosemary, the fragrant grey-green shrub that a Tudor knew as well for remembrance as for physic. Rosemary for remembrance, the old phrase ran, and it was carried at weddings and at funerals alike, worn and burned and laid upon the coffin, for it was believed to strengthen the memory and quicken the mind. In the sick room its branches were burned to sweeten and clear the air, and it was taken in a warm infusion for the head, for faintness, for a dull and heavy spirit, and to comfort the heart. It was, of all the head herbs, the most pleasant, filling a room with its clean resinous scent wherever it was crushed or burned. And here again the kernel is real, if quiet. Rosemary is rich in aromatic oils, and modern study has found faint, but genuine hints that its very scent can sharpen alertness a little and lift the spirits, and that the plant holds substances that guard the body's tissues in small ways. The old tie between rosemary and remembrance was not pure poetry. There was, folded inside the fragrance, a small true thread, and the Tudors, breathing it in at their weddings and their gravesides, were closer to a real virtue than they could ever have proved. Close beside the rosemary, and used for many of the same troubles of the head and the spirits, grew the lavender, whose clean, sweet scent the age loved above almost any other. Lavender was strewn and dried, and sewn into little bags to lay among the linen and beneath the pillow, and it was taken in a mild infusion and rubbed as an oil upon the temples, for the headache, for faintness, for the giddiness they called the swimming of the head, and for a restless and anxious mind. It was, of all the head herbs, the most purely pleasant, and the most reached for when what ailed a person was as much unease of the spirit as pain of the body. And here the small kernel is real once more, for the scent of lavender has been found, in our own careful measuring, to calm and soothe a little in truth, easing the way toward rest, so that the lavender bag beneath a Tudor pillow was a gentler and more genuine medicine than its keepers could have known. Let the fragrance of it settle over you now, the rosemary and the lavender together, the clean resinous sweetness that filled a Tudor sick room and a Tudor marriage bed alike. There is nothing in any of it that you need to carry forward, no herb to remember, and no virtue to recall. Let the head herbs do the one thing they were always best at, which was simply to make a troubled person a little calmer and a little drowsier, and let them do it for you now, as the evening deepens and the candle burns lower. Let us leave the head herbs now, drowsier for their fragrance, and turn to a cure that used no herb at all, but the letting of blood and the small dark creature kept in a jar for the purpose. Let us turn now to a cure that used no herb and no honey at all, but the letting of blood itself, and to the small dark creature the Tudors kept in a jar of water for the gentlest way of doing it. Bloodletting sat at the very center of learned Tudor medicine, so firmly at the center that to question it would have seemed as strange to them as questioning the rising of the sun. The whole grand theory of the four humours taught that health was a balance of blood and phlegm and the two biles, and that most sickness came of one humour rising too high, most often the blood, growing hot and thick and corrupt within, and the obvious remedy for too much blood was to let some out. So the sick were bled for fevers, for headaches, for madness, for the plague, for almost anything. And even the well were bled at the turning of the seasons, as a spring cleaning of the body, to carry off the thick winter blood before it could breed disease. It was done by the barber surgeon, whose striped pole, red for the blood and white for the bandage, still turns outside the barber's shop today, a last quiet relic of a time when the man who cut your hair also opened your vein. There was a whole learning wrapped around the doing of it, and much of it looks strange to us now. The barber surgeon and the physician both consulted charts, the almanacs of the year, and the diagrams they called the vein man or the zodiac man, a figure of a body ringed about with the signs of the heavens, telling which day and which sign governed each part, so that no vein was opened when the moon stood in the wrong quarter. Blood was taken by the careful ounce into marked bowls, and there were rules beyond counting for how much to take, and from which arm, and for which trouble, and even the healthy were bled at set seasons, a spring letting to carry off the thick blood of winter, taken almost as we might take a holiday, a thing everyone simply did. The leech had its own small trade, and a curious one. Leeches were gathered from the ponds and the marshes by leech gatherers, often poor women, who waded bare-legged into the water and let the creatures fasten onto their own skin, then picked them off and carried them home to sell, a hard and unlovely way to earn a living. Kept in jars of clean water, fed and tended, a good stock of leeches would serve a household or an apothecary for a long while, used and rested and used again. It is worth noting that the very word we still use, to call a physician a leech in the old tongue, and to call his craft leechcraft, came from this small dark worm and its long partnership with the healer. So deep did the letting of blood run in the whole idea of medicine. We must not soften how much harm all this did, for it did a great deal. To bleed the weak, the fevered, the wounded, the woman worn out with childbirth, to draw away the blood they most needed, hastened many thousands to their graves. Across the long centuries, the practice held sway, and its confident theory blinded its practitioners to the plain evidence of their own patients sinking beneath their hands. This is the hard heart of the chapter, and there is no kernel of gold to soften the whole of it, only the two small true threads we are coming to. Let that sit honestly for a moment before we find them. The doing of it took several forms. The boldest was to open a vein directly, most often at the arm, with a small sharp blade called a lancet, and let the blood run into a bowl until the surgeon judged enough had flowed, the amount and the timing often chosen by careful rules, and even by the position of the moon and the stars, for there were charts that told which day and which sign of the zodiac ruled each part of the body. Gentler was cupping, in which a heated glass was set on the skin to draw the blood to the surface, and gentlest of all, for the tender places where a blade would be perilous, was the leech. The leech is a soft dark water worm, gathered from the ponds and the slow streams and kept in jars of clean water in the apothecary's shop and the great house alike. Set upon the skin, it takes hold and draws blood slowly and almost painlessly, swelling as it feeds, and then falls away of its own accord when it is full. Its great use was for the delicate places where no surgeon would willingly set a lancet, close about the eyes, upon the gums, at the fundament for the piles, on the swollen and painful parts where a gentle, steady drawing of blood was wanted, and a bold cut was out of the question. A jar of hungry leeches was a standard thing in the medicine chest, homely and reliable and endlessly reused. Now here we must be more honest than we have needed to be about almost anything else tonight, for the plain truth is that bloodletting, taken as a whole, was one of the cures that mostly did not work and often did harm. To bleed a person already weakened by fever or by loss of blood, to open the vein of the sick and the failing and draw off the very blood they needed, was to weaken them further. And it is beyond doubt that the practice, for all its confident theory, sent a great many patients to their graves faster than they would otherwise have gone. This is the counter case in our evening, the great strange cure that was, for the most part, no cure at all, and it is worth meeting squarely, for not every old remedy hid a kernel of gold, and the honest herbalist admits as much. And yet, and this is the quiet surprise, even here a small true kernel can be found in two places. The first is that there truly are a few conditions, rare ones, in which removing blood is exactly the right thing to do, and is done in our own hospitals to this day. There is a sickness in which the body carries far too much iron, and another in which it makes far too many red cells, and for both of these the settled modern treatment is, quite simply, to draw off blood at intervals, the very thing the Tudor surgeon did for entirely mistaken reasons. So, for the occasional patient, hidden unknown among the thousands wrongly bled, the letting of blood was the precise and proper cure, stumbled upon blindly in a forest of error. The second kernel is the leech itself, and it is a real one. The leech does not merely suck. As it feeds, it bathes the wound in its spit, and that spit is a small pharmacy of its own, holding a powerful substance that keeps the blood from clotting, another that opens the small vessels, another that numbs the bite so the creature is scarcely felt, and others still that hold back the germs of infection. These are real and potent compounds, and they explain something remarkable. In our own age, after the whole theory of humours had been swept away and bloodletting abandoned as a folly, the leech quietly returned to the modern hospital by another door. When a surgeon reattaches a severed finger or moves a flap of living skin, the blood can flow in through the mended arteries faster than the smaller veins can carry it away, and the trapped blood threatens to kill the tissue. A leech set upon the congested part draws off the excess and, with its blood-thinning spit, keeps the flow moving for hours, buying the time the small veins need to regrow. It is approved and regulated for exactly this, a living medical instrument, so that the humblest tool of the most mistaken theory of Tudor medicine has outlived the whole grand edifice that once employed it and earned an honored place in the operating theater of today. There is a long, strange arc in that survival, worth a quiet moment. The leech went on being used and overused for centuries after the Tudors, its fashion swelling in a later age to such a height that whole countries stripped their ponds bare of the creatures and had to breed and import them by the million to meet the demand of the bleeding physicians. Then the theory of the humours crumbled at last. The bleeding stopped, and the leech fell into disuse and near disgrace, remembered only as a symbol of everything old medicine had got wrong. And then, quietly, in our own age, it came back once more, not for the old mistaken reasons, but for the true small chemistry of its bite, and took its place again in the most modern of operating theatres. Few things in the whole history of medicine have travelled so far, from the barber's jar to the byword for folly to the surgeon's careful ally. And the little dark worm has outlasted every physician who ever misused it. Let us leave the jar of leeches now, and turn from the letting of blood to a plant that could stop the heart or steady it, according to nothing but the measure of the dose. The foxglove. Let us turn now to the tall and beautiful spire of the foxglove, and to the strange truth that the deadliest plant in the English hedge was also, in a measure almost too small to see, a true mender of the failing heart. You will know the foxglove even if you do not know its name, for it stands in every wood edge and shady bank of an English summer, a tall stem hung with soft, drooping, thimble-shaped bells of purple-pink, freckled within. It is a plant of great beauty and great danger both, and the country people knew the danger well, for its folk names are a whispered warning passed down the generations. Fairy bells, they called it, and witches' thimbles, and, most darkly, dead man's bells, for to eat of it was to risk a death that began with a sick and swimming head, and ended with the heart itself faltering and stopping. This was no herb to be trifled with, and the learned herbalists treated it warily. John Gerard describes the foxglove in his great book, but notes that the physicians of his day made little use of it inwardly, and small wonder, for the line between its medicine and its poison was too fine for their art to walk with any safety. The condition it spoke to, in the folk medicine that dared to use it, was the dropsy, one of the most wretched and familiar afflictions of the age. In the dropsy the body swelled and filled with water, the legs and the belly growing heavy and taut with trapped fluid, the breath coming short, the patient slowly drowning from within. The Tudors did not know its cause, but we now know that a great part of the dropsy came from a failing heart, a heart grown too weak to drive the blood onward, so that the fluid backed up and pooled in the flesh. It was a slow swelling, smothering way to die, and against it the ordinary herbs of the garden were all but useless. Only the dangerous foxglove, in the hands of a few bold country healers, seemed sometimes to answer, drawing off the water, easing the breath, bringing a swollen and dying patient back from the edge, when it did not kill them first. Think, for a moment, of the courage and the care that such healing asked of the wise woman who dared it. She had before her a patient already dying, slowly drowning in their own trapped water, whom the physicians had given up. She had in her hand a plant she knew for a killer, and no scale fine enough, no measure sure enough, to tell her exactly how much would mend and how much would slay, and still, weighing the near certain death against the terrible risk, she gave it, watching every hour for the first sign that she had gone too far, ready to stop, trusting her long experience and her steady nerve where she had nothing else to trust. It was a fearful responsibility to carry, and the healers who carried it. Walking that knife edge for the sake of a neighbor the doctors had abandoned, deserve more remembering than history has given them. They were reaching, at real peril to themselves, and to those they treated, toward a truth that later, safer science would confirm and tame. Here the kernel is as real and as large as any in the whole evening, and it is written into the daily practice of modern medicine. The foxglove holds a family of powerful substances that act directly upon the heart, and in the right small measure they strengthen and steady the beat of a failing heart, so that it drives the blood onward once more, and the dropsical water is carried away. This is not folk fancy. A medicine drawn from the foxglove was, for the better part of 2 centuries, among the most important heart medicines in the world, and a refined form of it is prescribed still, in careful measured doses, for certain failing and unsteady hearts. The deadly fairy bell of the hedge holds, in its leaves, a true and precious cardiac medicine. The whole difficulty, the whole peril, the whole reason it killed as often as it cured, lay in the dose. For the amount that mends the heart, and the amount that stops it stand terribly close together. And the story of how that dose was tamed is one of the loveliest in all of medicine, and it honors exactly the kind of quiet country knowledge we have followed all night. So let us tell it, though it falls a little after the Tudor age. In the 1700s, an English doctor named William Withering was shown a folk remedy for the dropsy, a family receipt of many herbs kept by an old woman of Shropshire, a country cure that was working where the doctors had failed. Withering set himself to study it, and with real patience he picked apart the tangle of herbs until he found the one that mattered, the foxglove, and then he spent years learning, case by careful case, how much of it to give, and how to watch for the first signs of danger, so that its power could be used without its poison. He wrote it all down in a famous account of the foxglove, and in doing so he took a perilous secret of the cunning folk and made it into measured, teachable medicine. The old wise woman of Shropshire had known that the foxglove answered the dropsy. Withering learned how much, and in that how much lay the whole difference between a folk gamble and a saving cure. Let us dwell a moment longer on those folk names, for they are a kind of hidden knowledge in themselves. The country people who called the foxglove dead man's bells and witches' thimbles, and the fairy folk's glove were not merely being fanciful. They were passing down, in the only language they had, a plain warning about a dangerous plant, wrapping its peril in story, so that children would learn to leave it alone. To tie a plant to the fairies, in the old country mind, was often to mark it as uncanny and not to be trifled with, a thing of power that could turn on the careless. So the very prettiness of the names carried a caution inside it, a folk memory of every child who had ever sickened from the bright bells, handed down as legend, because legend was remembered where a plain warning might be forgotten. And Withering's patient work deserves a moment more, for it is the very model of how a folk gamble becomes a safe cure. He did not simply seize on the foxglove and dose people freely. He learned to read the plant's own warnings in the patient's body, the slowing and steadying of the pulse that told him the medicine was taking hold, and the first signs of a swimming head or a sick stomach that told him he had reached the very edge and must draw back. Year upon year, case upon careful case, he mapped the narrow country between too little and too much, and wrote it down so plainly that others could walk it after him without falling. The old woman of Shropshire had the destination. Withering drew the map. And between the two of them, the country healer's ancient knowing and the doctor's patient measuring, a deadly hedgerow flower became one of the steady saving medicines of the modern world. Let it settle gently now, this thought of the beautiful, dangerous bells, nodding in the summer shade, holding at once a death and a mending, divided only by the trembling matter of how much. There is nothing you need to do with it, and nothing to remember. Let the foxglove nod there quietly in the green shade of your drifting mind, lovely and lethal, and, in the right careful hands, a savour of failing hearts. So the foxglove leaves us with the deepest and most careful lesson of the night, and it is worth resting on before we move to the last cures. The Tudors were right that the dangerous plant held a great medicine, and the healers who used it for the dropsy were reaching, at real risk, toward a genuine and precious truth. What they lacked was the measure, the exact and careful dose that later ages worked out, drop by patient drop. The kernel of sense was there in the hedge all along, freckled and purple and lovely and lethal, waiting only for someone with the patience to learn its terrible arithmetic. Let us leave the foxglove standing in the shade, and turn from a plant that was itself a poison to the great fear that ran beneath so much of this old medicine, the fear of poison and the strange stones the Tudors trusted to guard against it. Let us turn now to a fear that ran quiet and deep beneath the whole of Tudor life, the fear of poison, and to the strange stones and horns the age trusted to guard against it. It is hard, from our safer age, to feel how real the dread of poison was to the Tudors, and above all to the great and the powerful among them. Poison was the shadow at the feast, the secret weapon of the ambitious and the wronged, and a prince or a wealthy lord might genuinely fear that any cup or dish set before him carried his death dissolved within it. Nor was the fear confined to the courts, for ordinary food and drink, spoiled or adulterated or gone bad in the heat, sickened and killed people often enough that a general wariness of what one swallowed was no madness but common prudence. Against this ever-present dread the age reached, as ages of fear will, for objects of power, for charms and stones and talismans that promised to make any poison harmless, and the greatest of these was the bezoar. The bezoar is a strange thing in itself, a hard, smooth, layered stone that forms slowly in the stomach or the gut of certain animals, of goats and deer and wild antelopes, built up around a seed or a hair, or a scrap of grit, much as a pearl forms in an oyster. These stones were gathered from the beasts of far countries, carried the length of the known world by traders, and sold in Europe for prices that could rival gold, the finest of them set in delicate cages of goldsmith's work, and passed down as the most precious of heirlooms. And what the bezoar promised was nothing less than safety from poison itself. Dipped into a suspect cup, or worn against the skin, or a little of it scraped and swallowed, the bezoar was believed to draw the venom out of anything, to neutralize any poison a person might take, whether by accident or by an enemy's design. A great man with a true bezoar felt he could dine in safety among his rivals. The bezoar did not stand alone in this shadowy pharmacy of protection. There was the toadstone, a smooth stone believed, quite wrongly, to grow in the head of an old toad, set into rings and worn on the finger, where it was said to grow warm or to change its color in the presence of poison, warning its wearer to set down the cup. What was sold as a toadstone was in plain truth no toadstone at all, but the smooth, button-shaped, fossilized tooth of a fish that had swum in the seas of a world unimaginably older than any toad, though of course no one who wore one could have dreamed such a thing. The belief was so precise, and so earnestly held, that there were even instructions for the proper winning of a toadstone, which was said to require setting a live toad upon a red cloth and waiting for it to give up its jewel, a piece of folklore as vivid as it was entirely without foundation. There was the horn of the unicorn, which was in truth the long spiral tusk of the narwhal, the sea creature of the far north, sold in shavings at prices beyond reason and stirred into drinks as the surest guard of all against venom. And there was coral, and there were precious gems, each credited with its own protecting virtue, a whole trade in beautiful and costly objects sold on the promise of a safety they could not truly give. To understand how the great could bear to spend so lavishly on a stone, you must feel how the fear pressed upon them. At the courts of the age, a prince dined surrounded by the possibility of betrayal, and had his food tasted before him, and knew that more than one rival had died, or was whispered to have died, with a swelling belly and a failing breath, after some ordinary-looking cup. Poison was the coward's weapon, and the ambitious one's, silent and deniable, and against so quiet a threat a man wanted more than a taster. He wanted a talisman, a thing of power he could dip in the cup or wear against his heart, and he would pay almost anything for the surest one to be had. The bazaar was the surest, and so the bazaar commanded prices that seemed to us like madness, and appeared, set in gold and carefully valued, in the inventories of kings and queens alongside their crowns and their plate. The unicorn's horn was prized even above the bazaar, and its story is stranger still. What was sold as unicorn's horn, the long straight spiraled staff called the alicorn, was in plain fact the tusk of the narwhal, the strange tusked whale of the frozen northern seas, though almost no one in Europe knew it. Whole ones stood among the greatest treasures of royal houses, valued at the price of a castle, and shavings of them were stirred into the drinks of the fearful, as the very surest guard against any venom. The Queen of England herself was said to keep such a horn among her treasures, and to set great store by it. That the most costly antidote in all of Europe was in truth a piece of a whale that no buyer had ever seen is one of the quiet ironies of the age. A fortune paid for the tooth of a sea creature in the belief that it was the horn of a beast that never lived at all. Settle in a moment here, if your eyes are growing heavy, for there is nothing in this that you need to hold on to. Let the goldsmith's bazaar, and the toadstone ring, and the unicorn's horn drift past you like objects glimpsed on a shelf in a dim shop, half seen and then forgotten. There is no test tonight, and no need to remember a single stone. We turn now to a moment when someone thought to ask, plainly, whether the bazaar truly worked, for it is one of the earliest and clearest little trials in the whole history of medicine, and it comes once more from the French surgeon Ambroise Paré. At the court of the French king, a fine bazaar was being praised as a certain cure for every poison, and Paré, ever the doubter, said aloud that he did not believe it. As it happened, a cook of the court had been condemned to hang for stealing, and the man was offered a bargain, that he should be given a poison, and then the famous bazaar, and if he lived he should go free. The cook agreed, hoping for his life. He was given the poison, and then the treasured bazaar, and it did nothing whatever to save him. He died some hours later in great pain, and Paré recorded the whole sorry business as plain proof that the bazaar was no universal antidote at all. It was a hard and pitiless little experiment, but it was an experiment, a real asking of the real question, at a time when few thought to ask it. So the bazaar, like the bloodletting before it, belongs mostly to the cures that did not work, a beautiful and costly faith with little behind it. And yet, true to the strange pattern of this whole evening, even the bizarre hides a small thread of real sense, and it was found only in our own age, when modern chemists took bizarre stones and steeped them in solutions of certain poisons. They discovered that the stones could indeed draw some poisons out, and one poison in particular. The compounds of arsenic, which happened to be among the favorite poisons of the age of the bizarre, will genuinely bind to the material of the stone and be partly pulled from the liquid. So a bizarre steeped in a cup, laced with arsenic, might truly have removed a portion of it and made the draught a little less deadly. It could not save Parry's poor cook, whose poison was of another kind, but against the very poison that the fearful lords of the age most dreaded, the humble stone from a goat's belly held, buried in its layers, a faint and genuine power. The dread was real, the stones were mostly theatre, and yet a single true thread of chemistry ran through the goat's quiet gift after all. And even the theatre was not without its use, in its way, for we should not be too quick to scorn the comfort these stones gave. A prince who believed himself guarded by a true bezoar, or by a shaving of the unicorn's horn stirred into his cup, dined with an easier mind, slept a little sounder, and carried through his dangerous days a measure of calm that a man in constant terror of poison could never have known. In an age that could offer so little real protection against the fear that gnawed at the powerful, a beautiful object that quieted that fear was not entirely a cheat, whatever it could or could not do to an actual poison. The mind it steadied was real, and a steadied mind is no small thing. So the poison stones leave us, like so much tonight, with a truth folded inside a falsehood, mostly empty of the power they claimed, and yet not quite empty, holding here a thread of real chemistry, and there a real and human comfort. In the beautiful, useless heart of them, let us leave the poison stones in their gold cages, and turn to the grandest and strangest medicine of the whole age, the great Treacle of the apothecaries. Let us turn now to Treacle, and to understand the word you must set aside at once the dark, sweet syrup it means to us today, for to a Tudor the word treacle meant something else entirely, the most costly, most complicated, and most celebrated medicine in the whole world. Its true and older name was theriac, and it was a compound of astonishing complexity, a single medicine made of dozens upon dozens of ingredients, 60, 70, sometimes more, ground and mixed and boiled together, and then, most strangely of all, left to age and mellow for months, or even years like a great wine, before it was thought fit to use. Into it went cinnamon and myrrh and rare gums, precious spices from the Far East, honey and wine, and, at its very heart, two ingredients that startle us now. One was the flesh of the viper, the venomous snake itself, caught and killed and boiled into the mixture. The other was opium, the dried tears of the poppy, in real and considerable quantity. This was theriac, and in its most famous form, it was made in the city of Venice and sold across all Europe as Venice Treacle, the supreme medicine, the king of the apothecary shelf. What was it for? The plainer answer is that it was for everything. Theriac had begun, in the deep ancient past, as an antidote to poison and to the bites of venomous creatures devised, the story ran, for a king so afraid of poison that he dosed himself daily against it. But over the long centuries its reputation had swollen, until it was held to cure very nearly anything, the plague above all, but also fevers, coughs, the bites of mad dogs, the troubles of the heart and the stomach, the pains of the body, and the fears of the mind. It was the medicine you reached for when the case was grave and you wanted the strongest and most trusted thing in the world, and it was priced accordingly. So dear that the making of the true Venice treacle was a civic event, carried out in public in the open squares under the eye of the city's physicians, so that all might see the precious ingredients go honestly into the pot and none be cheated. The pedigree of the great treacle ran back into the deep ancient world, and it began, fittingly, with a king afraid of poison. There was a monarch of the old East, Mithridates by name, so haunted by the fear of being poisoned that he was said to dose himself daily with a compound of many antidotes mixed together, taking a little of every known remedy at once, so that no single poison could ever find him unguarded, until his body was proof against them all. From him the medicine took one of its names, and to his mixture the physicians of Rome, Galen among them, added and refined across the centuries, folding in the flesh of the viper on the old reasoning that the creature which carried venom must also hold its cure, until the recipe swelled into the vast and famous theriac of the apothecaries. By the Tudor age the making of it had become a jealous and regulated trade. The finest came from Venice, but the apothecaries of London made their own, and the physicians watched the making with a wary eye. For so costly a medicine invited cheating, and a treacle made with poor or missing ingredients was a common and profitable fraud. So the true making was done openly, under inspection, and the buyer of a good treacle paid, not only for the rare ingredients, but for the assurance that they were truly there. It says something about the faith the age placed in this one medicine that men would trouble so greatly over the honesty of a thing whose grandest promises could never have been kept in any case. There is a small afterlife to the word itself that is worth a passing smile, because the treacle was so often made up into a thick, sweet, honeyed paste, an electuary, as the apothecaries called it. The word treacle drifted over the later centuries, away from the medicine and toward the sweetness, until at last it came to mean nothing but the dark sweet syrup we know by the name today. The grand and terrible antidote of kings dwindled across the long years into a thing we pour on a pudding, and only the word remains to remember that it was ever the mightiest medicine in the world. Rest here a while and let the picture settle. A great copper vessel in a Venetian square, the physicians in their robes looking on, the rare spices and the snake flesh and the poppy's gift all going into the pot, the whole city gathered to watch the making of its most famous cure. There is nothing here you need to remember, only a scene to drift upon, the smell of cinnamon and myrrh drifting over the water, the slow and solemn making of the medicine that promised to answer everything. We turn now to the plain question of whether it worked, and the honest answer is that it could not possibly have done the 1,000th part of what was claimed for it. No single medicine cures the plague, and the mad dog's bite, and the failing heart, and the fearful mind all at once, and a great deal of the theriac was, in truth, a costly and beautiful muddle. Dozens of ingredients thrown together on the reasoning that so many virtues combined must surely answer any ill, a reasoning that does not hold. In the great sweep of its promises, Treacle was among the emptiest cures of the age, sold on faith and mystery, and the comfort of reaching for the very best. And yet, as always tonight, the strange medicine hides a real kernel, and here the kernel is one we have been waiting for all evening, for it lay at the very heart of the pot. Theriac held opium, and opium is no muddle and no fancy. Opium is one of the oldest and truest medicines the world has ever known, a genuine easer of pain, a quieter of coughs, a calmer of the griping belly, a bringer of rest and sleep. A person racked with the pain of a grave illness, or worn out with a tearing cough, or wasting with a flux of the bowels, who was given a good dose of theriac, would very often feel a real and blessed relief, the pain melting, the cough stilling, a soft calm and drowsiness stealing over them. That relief was not imagined and not mere faith. It was the poppy at the center of the treacle, doing the one great thing the poppy truly does. And around that true core, the honey soothed, and the wine warmed, and the solemn ceremony, and the vast expense, and the whole world's faith in the medicine, wrapped the frightened patient in a powerful comfort of the mind, which is itself a real and gentle medicine in the sick room. There is a plain honesty in saying it so, that of the 60 or 70 ingredients ground and aged into the great treacle, one, and very nearly one alone, did the true and felt work, and that one was the quiet dried tears of the garden poppy. All the cinnamon and the myrrh, the rare gums and the boiled viper, the precious dusts brought half across the world, were in the main a costly and beautiful setting for a single working jewel. And yet the setting was not quite nothing either, for the faith it inspired was real, and a frightened, suffering person who believed with the whole force of the age that they held in their spoon the mightiest medicine on earth was comforted by that belief in a way we can measure even now. The treacle worked, in the end, by the poppy at its heart and the hope in its name. And both of those, the drug and the faith, were genuine powers in a sick room, however little the boiled snake and the golden dust between them ever did. There is a thread here that ties back to where our evening's bitter herbs began, and it is worth catching before we let the treacle go. You will remember that garlic, the cheap bulb of the poor man's kitchen, was called the poor man's treacle, the treacle of those who could never dream of the true Venice kind. And there is a rough justice in the name, for while the great treacle in its jar of gold held one true medicine buried among 60 useless ones, the poor man's garlic, costing nothing, held its own real and simple virtue plainly and without disguise. The grandest medicine and the humblest both worked, in the end, for the small honest reasons hidden inside them, and not for the grand ones printed on the label. Let us leave the great treacle mellowing in its jar, and turn now to the gentler waters the household distilled for itself, drawn quietly from the still in the corner of the room. Let us turn now to the gentler magic of the still itself, standing in its corner of the room, and to the clear and fragrant waters the Tudor household drew from it, drop by patient drop. The art of distillation was, in the Tudor century, a wonder still fairly new to the ordinary English house. A book explaining how to build and use a still had been translated into English early in the 1500s, and across the decades that followed the still became one of the proudest possessions of a well-kept stillroom, which took its very name from the thing. To distill was to gather the soul of a plant, or so it seemed, to take rose petals or herbs or wine, Warm them gently in the belly of the still, catch the rising vapor as it cooled and dripped from the beak, and so draw off a clear water or a clear spirit that held the scent and the virtue of the plant in a pure and keeping form. It seemed close to alchemy, and to the woman who worked the still it was among the most satisfying of all her crafts. The still itself came in more than one form, and a well-furnished still room might hold several. There was the tall glass or metal vessel with its curving beak that the old writers called the limbec or alembic. And there was the gentler cold still, in which the herbs were warmed only by the sun, or by a very low heat, thought to give the sweetest and most delicate waters of all. To distill well was a matter of real skill and real pride, knowing the heat, watching the first and the last of the run, keeping the vessels clean. And a woman celebrated for her waters was a woman of standing among her neighbors, her rose water and her cordials given as prized gifts and begged for by receipt. The waters she made were many, and their names read like a small poem of the age. Beside the rose water and the eyebright, there was cinnamon water and angelica water, and the sharp cordial drawn from the blessed thistle they called Carduus benedictus, which the age half believed a remedy for almost everything, so that in one play of the time a lovesick young woman is teasingly urged to lay some of it to her heart. There was surfeit water, taken after too rich or too heavy a meal, and there was even a plague water, a spirit steeped with a great tangle of strong herbs, and kept against the terrible summers when the sickness came. Each was drawn from the same patient still, and each carried, dissolved in its clear spirit, the caught soul of whatever herbs had gone into it. Let your eyes grow heavy here if they wish, for we are among the gentlest and most fragrant work of the whole house, and there is nothing in it that asks anything of you. Let the slow dripping of the still, and the smell of warm roses and cinnamon and sweet herbs drift through the quiet room and through your own slowing thoughts, and let every name of every water blur softly together and float away unremembered. The strongest thing the still could make was the spirit of wine itself, which the age called aqua vita, the water of life, a name that tells you at once how highly it was prized. This clear, fierce, warming spirit was given as a cordial to the failing and the faint, a few drops to revive someone sinking or chilled to the bone. And it was the base into which countless other medicines were steeped and dissolved, and it was splashed onto wounds, where it stung and cleaned. The gentlest and most beloved of the waters was rose water, distilled from the petals of the garden rose, cool and sweet, dabbed on hot brows and tired eyes, smoothed onto the skin, stirred into cooking and into medicines, and kept in every still room as a small everyday luxury that was also a mild and soothing physic. For the eyes in particular, the still room kept a special water, drawn from a little herb the old writers loved above all others for this one purpose, eyebright. Eyebright is a small, modest plant of the meadow and the down, and its very use was suggested in the thinking of the age by its look, for the small flower is streaked and spotted in a way that reminded people of a bloodshot eye, and by the old doctrine of signatures a plant that resembled a part of the body was thought to hold the cure for that part. So eyebright was distilled and infused into waters for every trouble of the eye, for soreness and dimness and weeping and strain, dropped into the eye or laid on in a wetted cloth, and trusted for all evils of the sight. Let your own eyes rest now, if they wish to, for we are among the gentlest cures of the whole evening, and there is nothing here that asks anything of you. Let the cool rose water, and the little eye bright, and the soft dripping of the still all blur together and drift, unremembered, into the quiet of the room. We turn now to the cordials, the waters made not for the wound or the eye, but for the heart and the spirits, for that word cordial means, at its root, a thing for the heart. Chief among them was a famous spiced water. The apothecaries called the wonderful water aqua mirabilis, a warming spirit steeped with many aromatic herbs and spices, taken to comfort a weak stomach, to revive the fainting, and to lift a low and heavy heart. And there were the flower cordials, made above all from borage and its cousin bugloss, the rough-leaved plants that open bright blue star-shaped flowers, floated in wine and steeped into waters expressly to drive away melancholy and gladden the mind. Borage, bring courage, ran the old rhyme, and the blue flowers were taken, in all seriousness, as a medicine against sorrow and fear. It is worth remembering that the low and heavy spirits were treated, in that age, as a real and serious affliction, not a mere sadness to be shrugged off. The melancholy, they called it, and they understood it as a true imbalance of the body, a settling of dark and heavy humours over the mind, and they reached for these bright cordials to lift and lighten it, as readily as they reached for a wound herb to close a cut. So the borage in the wine, and the wonderful water in its little glass, and the candied root nibbled by the fire, were all, in their keeper's eyes, medicines for the heart in the fullest sense, for the failing spirit as much as the failing flesh. There was a tenderness in this that is easy to overlook, a whole quiet branch of physic given over to comforting the frightened and gladdening the sorrowful. And if the herbs themselves did little, the care behind them did a great deal, and the warm sweet cordial offered by a gentle hand was a real solace to a heavy heart on a long night. There was even a sweetmeat kept for strength and comfort, the candied root of the sea holly, the spiny blue plant of the shore, whose long roots were dug, boiled, and candied in sugar into a restorative comfit called eringo, nibbled as a tonic and a strengthener, and credited, like so many strengthening things, with restoring the vigour of the old and the tired. It appears even in the plays of the age as a byword for such comforts, a small candide luxury that was also, in the mind of its eater, a medicine. All of these, the wonderful water and the borage wine and the candied eringo, belonged to the tender care of the heart and the spirits, the part of medicine that dealt not with the wound or the fever, but with the low and frightened and failing mood of a sick or sorrowful person. Now let us find the sense in all this fragrant distilling, and it lies in three quiet truths. The first and deepest is the spirit itself. Aqua vita, the water of life, was a real antiseptic when splashed on a wound, and far more importantly, it was the great preserver and drawer out of medicines. Strong spirit steeped with a herb pulls the plant's active substances out into itself and holds them, unspoiled, for months and years, and this is the whole foundation of the tincture, the herb steeped in spirit, which remains to this day one of the truest and most useful forms of plant medicine there is. In learning to distill their aqua vita, the Tudors had laid hold, without quite knowing it, of the key that unlocked and preserved the virtue of every other herb on their shelves. The second truth belongs to the gentle waters for the eyes and skin. A clean, mild, distilled water of rose or eyebright was genuinely soothing to a sore and irritated eye, and, quite apart from any special virtue of the herb, it was cleaner than the pond water or the well water that was the only other thing to hand, for the making of it had driven off much that fouled ordinary water. To bathe an inflamed eye in cool, clean rose water was a real small kindness to it, and did more good than harm, which in the medicine of the age was no small praise. And the third truth is the kindest of all, and belongs to the cordials of the heart. A frightened, low, exhausted person, given a warm and fragrant and gently spirited cordial, made with care and offered with love, truly does feel comforted and revived. The warmth and the sweetness and the mild spirit and the tender attention all working together to lift the sinking spirits. The Tudors could not have measured this, but they felt it plainly, and they were not wrong. Let us leave the still to its slow dripping now, and turn, at the very last, to the gentlest cure of the whole long evening, the one that has been quietly waiting for us all along, the poppy and the herbs of sleep. Let us turn now, as our evening draws toward its close, to the last and gentlest of all the strange cures, and to the one that every other cure tonight was, in the end, only trying to reach: rest, sleep, the quieting of pain and the coming of the dark. At the heart of it stood the poppy, grown in many a Tudor garden for its beauty and its seed, and, quietly, for the milk that could be drawn from its ripening heads. From the poppy came opium, and though the Tudors did not grow or prepare it on the great scale of later ages, they knew its power well, and the apothecary kept syrups and waters made from the poppy for exactly the purposes opium has always served. A syrup of poppies was given to still a tearing cough, to quiet the griping of the bowels, to ease a deep and grinding pain, and above all to bring sleep to those whom pain or fever or sorrow kept from it, to the restless, the dying, and the fretful wakeful child. Of all the strange cures we have handled tonight, the poppy is perhaps the least strange in its working and the most honest, for it did, plainly and powerfully, the very thing it promised. It brought ease, and it brought sleep. The poppy of the medicine was the pale garden poppy, grown for its beauty and its oily seed, and, quietly, for the milk that could be drawn from its unripe heads, or steeped out of them in water and wine. From this came the syrups, and the sleepy waters the apothecary kept. And though the Tudors did not command the strong and refined preparations of later ages, they knew the poppy's power well enough, and reached for it when nothing gentler would answer, for the tearing cough that would not let a sick man rest, the griping flux of the bowels, the deep pain of a grave illness, and the long sleepless nights of the suffering and the dying. The poppy also lay at the heart of one of the boldest strange cures of the whole older world, the sleep that surgeons gave before the knife. Long before the Tudors, and lingering into their age, healers made a soporific sponge soaked in the juices of the poppy and of other sleep-bringing plants and dried, to be moistened and held beneath the nose of a patient who must be cut, so that he might sink into a deep sleep and feel less of the surgeon's work. Into it went the poppy, and with it the dangerous henbane and the strange forked root of the mandrake, plants so potent and so perilous that the sleep they gave stood always a little too close to the sleep from which there is no waking. It was a genuine reaching toward the mercy that later ages would perfect, the putting of a patient gently to sleep through pain, attempted centuries too early with tools too blunt and too dangerous to be safe, and yet real and aimed true, and born of the same deep wish to spare suffering that runs through all the kindest medicine of every age. We must say gently, as we have said of the other strong cures, that this same power carried a shadow, for opium is as dangerous as it is kind, and the line between the dose that eased and the dose that harmed was one the Tudors could not always find, above all for the very young. It is one of the sorrows of the history of medicine that the poppy, so merciful to the suffering, was also, in careless or desperate hands, a danger to the children it was meant to soothe. We tell this, as we tell all of it, only as history, and we leave the poppy with both of its faces gently acknowledged, the great mercy and the real peril folded together, as they so often were in the medicine of that distant age. Let the thought of sleep begin to settle over you now, as softly as it settled over a Tudor household when the poppy syrup was set aside and the candle burned low. There is nothing left to learn tonight, and nothing at all to remember. Let your breathing slow, and let the strange cures of the day drift away from you one by one. Beside the strong poppy the household kept a whole shelf of gentler friends of sleep, and these had no shadow on them at all. First and best loved was chamomile, the small white daisy flower of the meadow and the path, steeped into a mild and pleasant tea for restless evenings and for fretful children, so gentle that it could be given almost without a second thought. There was valerian, the herb the old writers sometimes called all-heal, whose root, for all its odd smell, was taken to calm the nerves and settle a troubled mind toward sleep. There were the hops of the brewing, sewn into a small pillow and laid beneath the head to bring on drowsiness, a hop pillow being an old and trusted charm against a wakeful night. And there was even the humble lettuce of the garden, whose milky sap was known to hold a mild and sleepy virtue, so that a supper of lettuce was thought to ease a person gently toward bed. There was a whole soft ritual of the sleep, pillow woven around these gentle herbs, and it is a fitting thing to rest on as our own evening draws down toward sleep. Into a small pillow or a little cloth bag went the dried hops and the lavender and the sweet herbs of the summer, and this was laid beneath the head at night, so that the drowsy scent rose warm and faint about the sleeper through the dark hours. Around it gathered all the other small kindnesses of the Tudor bedtime, the warm and lightly spiced drink, the last herbs steeped by the fire, the banking of the embers, the drawing of the curtains against the cold. None of it was dramatic, and none of it needed to be, for the whole quiet apparatus of it worked gently and together to ease a tired body over the edge into rest, exactly as such small rituals still do on such nights as this one, wherever a person prepares themselves softly for sleep. And here, in these last quiet herbs, the sense and the cure are one and the same, for our own age has looked at every one of them and found the old faith sound. Chamomile holds a mild substance that genuinely calms and soothes toward sleep, and it is drunk for exactly that by the cupful, the world over, to this very night. Valerian holds real substances that quiet the nerves and ease the coming of sleep, studied and confirmed in the modern laboratory. The hops of the sleep pillow carry a true and gentle drowsy virtue, and the milky lettuce a fainter one. The Tudors, reaching for their chamomile and their valerian, and their hot pillow against a sleepless night, were reaching for medicines as real and as gentle as any we have. Of all the strange cures of the evening, these last are the least strange and the most kind, and they ask nothing of us now but to let them work. So we come to rest where the whole of medicine, in every age, has always come to rest at last, at the simple and enormous fact that the body heals itself best in sleep, and that the oldest and truest cure of all is the quiet dark and the slow breath and the letting go of the day. The Tudors knew this in their bones, as every tired and suffering people has always known it, that beneath all the honey and the cobwebs and the bitter herbs and the great golden treacle, the deepest healer was rest itself. And that is the cure we come to now. We have wandered a long way tonight, through a great many strange and unlikely remedies, and found, curled inside nearly every one of them, a small, quiet kernel of real and honest sense. The honey that truly cleaned a wound, the cobweb that truly staunched the blood, the green mould that held, all unknowing, the seed of the greatest medicine of our own age, the willow bark that became the tablet in the drawer, the garlic that was a real defense, the vinegar that truly cleaned, the snail whose slow secretion soothes the skin still, the maggot that cleaned what no knife could, the comfrey that mended, the plantain that soothed, the bitter herbs that killed the worm, the little feverfew that quieted the aching head, the leech that outlived the theory that raised it, the foxglove that steadied the failing heart, the humble stone that could bind a poison, the great treacle with the poppy at its center, the clear waters of the still, and at the very last the poppy and the chamomile that bring the sleep we come to now. There is nothing left to remember and nothing left to do. The candle in the still room has burned down to its last soft glow. The still stands quiet in its corner. The jars are stoppered on their shelves, and the long strange day of cures is over. Let it all settle gently into the dark alongside you. If your eyes closed somewhere among the herbs and the honey, that was always exactly the point of the evening, and there is nothing at all that you have missed. Sleep well. The quiet apothecary will be back soon with another quiet chapter. For now there is only the low steady dark, the last of the candlelight fading gently to nothing, and the whole of a long night ahead of you, unhurried and entirely your own. Rest now. The shelves are full, the door is barred against the cold, and every strange and gentle cure has been quietly put away. Good night.